Welcome to the Joseph Smith's Polygamy, Nancy Rigdon, and the Happiness Letter video. All right, preliminary statement from the Mormon apologist Patrick Mason, pictured above. He was on Mormon Stories in 2022, episode 1657, talking a little bit about polygamy here, being fairly honest, especially for an apologist. Mason says, Joseph Smith's polygamy, I don't want to put lipstick on a pig, and I don't like it. But he, Joseph Smith, also slept with a lot of these women, had sex with them. I don't agree with any of that stuff. I can even say that a lot of that looks a whole lot like sin. A lot of Joseph Smith's polygamy looks a whole lot like sin. And in this video, we're going to show that it not only looks like sin, it probably is sin. Okay, a few facts about Nancy Rigdon. She was born on December 8, 1822. This was about 7.5 years before the church was established, the Mormon Church. This is a picture from AI of something that she might have looked like, a 19-year-old woman in Nauvoo around the year 1842. All right. Sidney Rigdon was Nancy's father. He was baptized into the church on November 1830, so pretty early on. Sidney was also a scribe for Joseph Smith in the same year, 1830. Nancy Rigdon was baptized at the same time as her father, around the age of 8. So she was pretty young when she came into the church. You can find this information at the Joseph Smith papers at the sources listed below. All right, Sidney Rigdon was formerly a Baptist minister, and he converted hundreds of members from his congregations over to Mormonism. So very important to get all these members into Mormonism. I'm sure Joseph Smith was very pleased with this. You can see Wikipedia Nancy Rigdon article. This is a picture of Sidney Rigdon above as depicted by AI, preaching to some of his Baptist congregations. Okay, according to the historian Richard Van Wagner in his book Sidney Rigdon, A Portrait of Religious Success, 1994, according to Richard, Sidney first met Joseph Smith on December 11th, 1830. And then I say Nancy, who was 8 years old, as we talked about, probably met Joseph around this time as well. So Joseph had a long time to work on Nancy and probably knew her pretty well. Her dad was a very important person in the early church. Okay, according to the Joseph Smith papers, Sidney Rigdon was ordained a high priest in the Mormon Church in June of 1831. He was Joseph Smith's counselor, basically in the First Presidency, or they called him the assistant president of the church, and he was in this role from 1832 to 1844. All right, the first record we have of Joseph Smith meeting Nancy Rigdon was on July 31st, 1832. A letter from Joseph Smith to W.W. Phelps, Joseph Smith Papers. Jonathan Streeter pointed out this source. Basically, Joseph Smith held a meeting on the Lord's Day. Nancy Rigdon was there. Somebody gave Nancy a blessing. Not sure if that was Joseph Smith or not, but they were both at the same place here in 1832. All right, Nancy Rigdon, as we mentioned, was born in 1822. Joseph Smith proposed to Nancy either to be a concubine or a plural wife, whichever one she wanted, I guess. Joseph made this proposal in April of 1842. You can see the Joseph Smith papers. So Nancy was 19 years old at the time of this proposal, and Joseph Smith was 37 years old. Big age gap there. Okay, there was some chatter in Kirtland, Ohio in September of 1837. So before the whole episode with Nancy, before the Happiness Letter came out, this was some chatter of some kind of inappropriate behavior between Joseph Smith and the family of Sidney Rigdon. The source for this is from Oliver Cowdery's brother, Warren A. Cowdery, in the Messenger and Advocate, like I said, September 1837. It says, having learned from a respectable source that rumors were afloat and had gained some credence in your towns in Ohio. These rumors were derogatory to the characters of Joseph Smith Jr. and the family of Sidney Rigdon. We therefore deem it our duty to say in defense of injured innocence that we have the best of reasons for saying that the reports to which we have alluded are without any foundation in truth. They're supporting Joseph Smith, of course. This is a church newspaper, Messenger and Advocate. Two possibilities here who these family members might have been. It might have been Nancy Rigdon, might have been Athalia Rigdon. Nancy would have been 14 at this time. Her older sister Athalia would have been almost 16. A possible sealing is mentioned between Joseph and Athalia in the source Public Discussions between Kelly and Braden, 1884, which we'll get to. Nancy Rigdon would deny this sealing between Joseph and Athalia in the same year, 1884, in an interview which showed up in the history of the reorganized church. All right, same source from the Messenger and Advocate, 1837. Since our acquaintance with Joseph Smith Jr., there has been the strongest ties of friendship existing between himself and Sidney Rigdon. All right, the account continues, and we hazard nothing in saying, were those reports true about Nancy or Athalia, that must have originated in your vicinity. The bonds of friendship would have been severed forever between them, between Joseph and Sidney, if any of these reports were true about Sidney's daughters. All right, we are fully sensible and are willing, as far as the character of Joseph Smith Jr. is concerned, to pronounce the whole thing a sheer fabrication. Okay, the account continues from Warren A. Cowdery, editor of the Messenger and Advocate. Relative to the family of Sidney Rigdon, we have to say that it is large, consisting mostly of females, young, innocent, unsuspecting, without reproach, and for aught we know above suspicion. So what were these rumors going on at the time? We're not quite sure. Any information we have about this comes way later in 1884, except for this 1837 account in the Messenger and Advocate. Sidney did have a very large family, 11 children eventually. Eventually he had 6 daughters, and I'll show you that list later on in the video. Okay, interesting to note that Nancy Rigdon was part of the Relief Society. She was there at the very first meeting in Nauvoo in March 17, 1842. If you look at the records of those who were there at that first meeting, 2 of the names were stricken through. Those 2 names were Athalia and Nancy. Athalia would go on to marry George Robinson. Later histories don't mention them as being at that first meeting. Why were their names stricken through? Because they became apostates, right? I think largely due to this interaction they had with Joseph Smith and his proposal to Nancy, either to be a concubine or plural wife. So their names were blotted out, so to speak. Like it says in the Book of Mormon, this information comes from Maureen Beecher in the Journal of Mormon History. Okay, so a couple of weeks later, after the Relief Society was first established, May 31st, 1842, we get an interesting letter from Joseph Smith to Emma Smith regarding the Relief Society. This can be found in the Joseph Smith Papers. We, Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, have been informed that some unprincipled men, whose names we will not mention at present, have been guilty of such crimes of sexual sin. Remember, Nancy's at this meeting. We do not mention their names, not knowing but what they may be some among you. Not knowing but what there may be some among you who are not sufficiently skilled in masonry as to keep a secret. What was ever going on with these unprincipled men and some of the women, I guess in the Relief Society, that was to be kept a secret. Emma pictured above. All right, Joseph Smith would go on to say in 1843 that the secrets of Masonry is to keep a secret. And the Relief Society wasn't informed enough about Masonry to know this, that they should be keeping a secret. This is in Joseph Smith's journal, October 15th, 1843, Joseph Smith Papers. Okay, so back to the letter from Joseph Smith to Emma Smith, his wife, regarding the Relief Society, March 31st, 1842. This is still before the proposal to Nancy and the happiness letter, a little bit before. Joseph Smith says, "For we don't want anybody to believe anything as coming from us contrary to the old established morals and virtues and scriptural laws regulating the habits, customs, and conduct of society, the old morality, unless it be by message delivered to you by my own mouth, Joseph Smith, by actual revelation and commandment." So we'll keep the old laws of society, you know, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not commit fornication, thou shalt not have concubines. We'll keep that unless, Joseph Smith says, by divine revelation and commandment, that you should commit adultery, that you should be a concubine, that you should have sex with him. He uses the language of revelation and commandment, which is found actually in the happiness letter, which we're going to get to all the contents of the happiness letter. He creates a loophole here, basically, to get out of all those old established morals and virtues. And this is basically so that Joseph Smith can have sex with some of these women. All right, interesting information here about Martha Brotherton. First source, Minutes and Discourses. First week in April 1842, Joseph Smith Papers, about a week before the whole affair with Nancy and the happiness letter. Hiram Smith then spoke in contradiction of a report in circulation about Heber C. Kimball and Brigham Young himself and others of the 12, alleging that his sister Martha Brotherton had been shut in a room for several days and that they had endeavored to induce her to believe in having two wives. High leaders of the church. Hiram was assistant president. Heber Kimball was an apostle. Brigham was president of the 12. Some kind of a report that this lady, Martha Brotherton, had been shut in a room for several days to try to get her to believe in polygamy. Martha would go on later to give an affidavit, July 13th, 1842. This is found in John C. Bennett's book, History of the Saints. Also showed up in a couple of newspapers. So, like I said, a few months later, Martha gave an affidavit stating that Kimball, Young, and Joseph Smith, which was left out from those minutes, Kimball, Young, and Joseph Smith led her to Joseph's store/office, locked the door, closed the window, and drew the curtain. This is from Martha herself in, 1842, July of 1842. She doesn't say for several days, but she does say lock the door, close the window, and drew the curtains. And this was all orchestrated by Kimball, Young, and Joseph Smith. Young then asked her to be a plural wife. Joseph Smith told her that polygamy is lawful and right before God. I know that it is. If you will accept Brigham, you will be blessed. God shall bless you, and my blessing shall rest upon you. Joseph Smith's blessing shall rest upon you. A lot of this language is actually found in the happiness letter. Lawful and right is found in there. Blessings are found in there. Joseph and Brigham then made Martha promise not to tell anybody what had happened. So this is all interesting right around this whole time of the happiness letter. All right, let's talk about the funeral of Ephraim Marks, April 9th, 1842. This is how we can date this happiness letter more accurately. Happiness letter sometime in mid-April. This is April 9th, 1842 for this funeral. President Sidney Rigdon gave a talk about happiness. He said, when we see a principle that makes us the most happy, If we will cultivate that principle and practice it ourselves, it will render others happy. This is in the Wilford Woodruff Journal, Volume 2. Joseph Smith would talk about parts of Sidney's sermon in his happiness letter. I think he did kind of repurpose the meaning of the word happiness, which I'll get to. But yeah, this funeral was before the happiness letter. Rigdon's talking about happiness, and then Joseph Smith talks about happiness in his letter to Nancy. Joseph Smith also spoke at the funeral, as we know from the History of the Church, Volume 4. It says, President Smith made many other interesting remarks and left it for President Rigdon to close. Some historians, like Chris Smith, asked the question, was Joseph Smith trying to manipulate Nancy by using some of her father's language? I think Chris says yes, he thinks so. Yeah, maybe. Okay, let's get to some of the wording of the happiness letter. This is from the prophet Joseph Smith, a letter to Nancy Rigdon in mid-April of 1842, according to the Joseph Smith papers, first published in the Sangamo Journal, August 19, 1842, so several months after it was written. A few weeks before that, on August 3rd, 1842, John C. Bennett, formerly a close associate of Joseph Smith, mayor of Nauvoo, and also assistant president of the church, basically in the First Presidency, he forwarded the letter to the editor of the Sangamo Journal. This is all according to the Joseph Smith papers. All right, so let's read the first part here. Happiness is the object and design of our existence and will be the end thereof, if we pursue the path that leads to it. And the path is virtue, uprightness, faithfulness, holiness, and keeping all of the commandments of God. And one of the commandments from Joseph to Nancy is going to be, don't you want to be a concubine? Don't you want to be a wife? Don't you want to practice polygamy? That's one of the commandments, and you got to keep all of them, right? Joseph is God's mouthpiece. I kind of think that he's using this word happiness here kind of in a sexual way. Happiness is the object and design of our existence, right? It's biological, it's natural. Sex will give you pleasure. It will make you happy. I'm a good-looking guy. We can just do this. God has commanded it. There's no problem with it. He maybe got the idea to use the word happiness from Sidney Rigdon at that funeral a short time before this. Nancy would have been Joseph Smith's 11th wife, or concubine. The other 10 were ages 16 to 47, so he'd already married a 16-year-old. We've talked about Joseph using that word commandment in relationship to polygamy and getting women to practice polygamy with him. We've already shown that he's used that in sources outside of the happiness letter. We're going to show some more of those sources where he uses that again outside of the happiness letter, that polygamy is a commandment, a divine revelation. All right, so if you happen to be a member of the Mormon Church and you're watching this video, probably kind of unlikely unless you're having doubts. First of all, maybe you didn't even know that Joseph Smith was practicing polygamy and that he married something like 35 wives or concubines. And then the next step after that is you're probably not going to believe that he was having sex with any of these wives or concubines. You can go back to one of my videos called Did Joseph Smith Have Sex with His Polygamous Wives?, where I go over a lot of the evidence that shows, yes, he was polygamous, and yes, he did have sex with a lot of these wives. He was trying to with Nancy. So go and watch that. If you have a question about this, go back and watch that video, and hopefully you'll find that convincing, or maybe you won't. I don't know. All right. I forgot to mention on the previous slide that first part of the happiness letter, happiness is the object and design of our existence, that's been quoted so many times by Mormon prophets, seers, and revelators in General Conference, in the Ensign, and other sources. But they never give the context of the letter. The context of the letter is, of course, polygamy. So let's read a little bit more from the happiness letter. we cannot we cannot keep all the commandments without first knowing them. And Joseph is going to teach to Nancy that one of those commandments is polygamy. And we cannot expect to know all or more than we know now unless we comply with or keep those that we have already received. So he's basically saying, I'm going to teach us this new commandment. Maybe you didn't know about it, that you should practice polygamy with me. And then after that, you can receive more. I'll teach you even more. You'll receive more from God. So it's kind of unlocking the mysteries of God in a way. Of course, that word commandment shows up in other sources related to polygamy that we've gone over. One, we'll go over more. The church is, even today, is still using this same kind of language to explain why Joseph practiced polygamy. In the Doctrine and Covenants 2021 manual, Come Follow Me for Sunday School, they say plural marriage is acceptable to God only when he commands it. All right, back to the happiness letter by the prophet Joseph Smith. That which is wrong under one circumstance may be and often is right under another. God said, thou shalt not kill. At another time, he said, thou shalt utterly destroy. Kind of opposite commandments, right? So that which is right under one circumstance can be wrong under another, and often is. Often, usually, not sure there. These ideas and language are used by the prophet Joseph Smith outside of the happiness letter and other sources, and we're going to get to those. Thou shalt not kill, that's found in Exodus. Thou shalt utterly destroy, found in Deuteronomy 20. So he is right here. Joseph is right about, the Old Testament. They do sometimes give opposite commandments, which is moral relativism, right? So in Deuteronomy, that was basically the Lord saying, commit a genocide of these 6 nations mentioned in Deuteronomy 20, which you can see here. The Apostle Willard Richards wrote a similar concept to Joseph Smith to his wife Janetta, February 26, 1842, about a month and a half before the happiness letter. Interesting to note that Willard was the scribe for the happiness letter. In other words, Joseph Smith dictated the happiness letter to Willard. And Willard had these concepts a month and a half before the happiness letter. He says, to live by revelation, present revelation, do what God requires of us and not what he requires of somebody else. So he might require polygamy for someone, and then someone else might require non-polygamy. And this idea that it comes from revelation, what you should do, that also shows up in the happiness letter, that word revelation. And then in D&C 9330, it says, all truth is independent in that sphere in which God has placed it to act for itself. So in different spheres or different circumstances, you can have different truth, basically, according to the D&C. So all these kind of concepts here are not only in the happiness letter, but they're in a lot of other sources. And of course, D&C 93, that's written or revealed by Joseph Smith. All right, so is morality relative? Are there no objective universal moral truths at all? So moral relativism, according to the Old Testament and Joseph Smith, morality is relative. According to Jesus Christ in the New Testament and some of the Mormon modern day prophets, seers, and revelators, morality is not relative, and we'll get to some of those. Okay, let's read some more. This is the principle on which the government of heaven is conducted. Moral relativism, principle of heaven. It's conducted by revelation adapted to the circumstances in which the children of the kingdom are placed. Adapted to the circumstances for the children of the kingdom. Nancy made to feel special here. She's one of the children of the kingdom. Whatsoever God requires is right, no matter what it is. although we may not see the reason thereof until long after the events transpire. So this language, revelation adapted, has been used by Apostle John Taylor and the Apostle Orson Pratt in relationship to moral relativism, remember. That exact language, revelation adapted, we'll get to those quotes. To the circumstances in which the children of the kingdom find themselves. Circumstance language has been used by Apostle John Taylor and the Apostle Orson Pratt as well. We'll get to those quotes. Circumstances has been used as language by Joseph Smith in other sources as well, in relationship to this idea of moral relativism. So we'll get to that. Moral relativism is condemned in the Book of Mormon. Yeah, we're going to talk about that on an upcoming slide. There's also some contradictions and some opposites in the Book of Mormon, though, as well. Moral relativism is often condoned by atheists, or if it's not condoned, they're not able to prove that there is an objective morality because atheists don't really have a book to base it on. This ultimate book that comes from the ultimate authority of God, right? Like Christians have. If you see debates about whether or not God exists and you watch these evangelicals and these Protestants, something they're very proud of, that they have objective morality that comes from the Bible. Of course, they never mention that there's opposite moralities in the Bible, such as thou shalt not kill and thou shalt kill, which we talked about. There's similar language from the Happiness Letter in D&C 132, revelation given to Joseph Smith about polygamy. Whatever God requires is right. And then in D&C 132, whatsoever you give on earth, whatsoever, both in a polygamy context. D. Michael Quinn pointed that one out. D&C 132 also has language of blessings and cursings in relationship to polygamy. Happiness Letter has that too, blessings and cursings. Okay, the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible has some of this moral relativism in it too. In their translation, this is Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon's translation of Romans 7, verses 15 through 21. We have this idea of moral relativism again, that whatever God commands is right, even if it's opposite commandments to different people. It says, for that which I am commanded to do, I do. And that which I am commanded not to allow, I allow not. But the evil which I would not do under the law, I find to be good. The evil is good, and that I do. You could put in there the evil of polygamy, which I would not do under the law, I find to be good. So yeah, Joseph Smith had this idea of moral relativism very early on because he was working on the JST from 1830 to 1833. Okay, let's talk a little bit about moral relativism being condemned in the Book of Mormon. First off, Korihor, the Antichrist, Alma 30, verse 17. Korihor says, whatsoever a man does is no crime. He can do whatever he wants. Murder, practice polygamy, whatever. That's the teaching of an Antichrist and the teaching of Joseph Smith. Also, King Lamoni said they supposed that whatsoever they did was right. You can do whatever you want, right? Alma 18:5. Ammon presumably corrected King Lamoni because these are antichrists. We should not be doing moral relativism. But then if you look at other parts of the Book of Mormon, moral relativism is condoned. Mosiah 13:21, thou shalt not kill. Compare this to Nephi killing Laban to get the brass plates, as commanded by God. Opposite commandments. And God wiping out entire cities through the Nephites and Lamanites. They would go to war with each other. God would help one side or the other to take their chosen land, to bless them, right? God would command them to wipe out entire cities and help them to wipe out entire cities. That's opposite to thou shalt not kill. The Apostle Dallin H. Oakes has condemned moral relativism many times. He's second in command in the church right now. Here's a couple examples listed here. The Apostle D. Todd Christofferson has as well, condemning moral relativism many, many times. It's one of his talking points. And we will quote a little bit from one of those talks on the next slide, I think. But here's a couple of those sources. Okay, one example from D. Todd Christofferson, addressed to religious educators, January 26, 2018. Moral relativism just doesn't work. If there is to be order and justice in society, can murder be wrong for most but right for some? I have to say I agree with him on certain things, right? Murder, adultery, you could go down the list of those important laws that a society really needs to be healthy. Joseph Smith said the opposite, however. That which is wrong under one circumstance may be and often is right under another. Joseph Smith pointing out, yeah, sometimes God asks us to kill, and sometimes he says, thou shalt not kill. Okay, we have a source here by the Apostle Willard Richards to his wife Janetta, February 26, 1842, about a month and a half before the happiness letter was written by Joseph. Similar concepts here. Willard says, there are many things recorded of the old patriarchs and prophets which have seemed bad to us, which if we knew the reasons thereof and the order of God would appear right. So polygamy is one example, right? The old patriarchs and prophets maybe practiced polygamy, which maybe seemed bad to us, but if we know the order of heaven, it'll appear right. So these ideas are in the air a month and a half before the happiness letter. Where's Willard getting these ideas? Maybe Joseph Smith. The historian Devery S. Anderson is the one that pointed this source out. He did a presentation at Sunstone. You can see the source here. Devery says, it is clear from Willard's letter to Janetta that he was familiar with the language and concepts found in the Nancy Rigdon letter, which helps us to verify its authenticity. Remember, Willard is Joseph Smith's scribe and his scribe for the happiness letter. And Willard appears to know these concepts kind of before the happiness letter even comes out. Why do we need to verify the authenticity of this happiness letter? Well, it's because now the church and the Joseph Smith Papers editors are trying to cast as much doubt on the happiness letter as they can as far as Joseph Smith being the author of it. We'll get to all that. But the happiness letter has some damning stuff in it. So now the church's strategy is to try to cast doubt that Joseph Smith was the author. But what I'm doing in this video is showing all the similarities and exact language in the happiness letter compared to a lot of other sources, and even by a lot of other sources by Joseph Smith. All right, so here's one of those sources from the Apostle John Taylor, Journal of Discourses in 1872. So quite a long time after the happiness letter, but these concepts still appear to be in the air, and the exact language from the happiness letter. So Taylor says, if we trace the records of Scripture through, we shall find that men generally sought for themselves guidance and direction and revelation adapted to the peculiar circumstances in which they were placed. It is a revelation adapted peculiarly to the position that we occupy in these last days. Exact language is in the happiness letter, right? Revelation adapted, circumstances. All right, the Apostle Orson Pratt, too, which we talked about in his Divine Authenticity of the Book of Mormon pamphlet, 96-page pamphlet. Also talking about this moral relativism, probably got it from Joseph, right? This is only in 1850, so only 8 years after the happiness letter. Pratt says, nothing can be more erroneous than to suppose that the revelations given to one individual, people, or generation are sufficient to fully develop the duties of another individual, people, or revelation. Happiness letter uses that language of divine revelation. All right, Apostle Orson Pratt continues, there are many duties which are limited in their nature and only required of such as God may name or designate under existing circumstances. Circumstances is language from the Happiness Letter. All right, Pratt continues, those individual or circumstantial laws which are limited to the individuals for whom they are given are changeable in their nature. This includes polygamy, right? Pictured above, who am I to judge? Moral relativism. All right, Pratt continues, new circumstances require new laws which must continue to change in order to suit the condition of the people. Circumstances language. And Pratt was right as far as how the church has evolved. Not one single teaching has remained the same. Watch some of my other videos where I talk about Charles Harrell's book. All right. No man, either in the ancient or modern times, has ever yet learned his whole duty from the general laws which God has revealed. General law is not enough, right? Ten Commandments not enough, because sometimes God asks you to do the opposite. All right. Without new revelation adapted to the peculiar condition of himself as an individual and varied at sundry times according to the change of circumstances, he will forever remain ignorant of a part of his duty. Exact language from the Happiness Letter, right? Revelation adapted to conditions and circumstances. All right, Pratt kind of repeats himself here. I'll go through this quickly. As the present generation are so universally in error in supposing that the ancient revelations are sufficient for all present purposes, we shall point out still further the absurdity of this supposition by showing the distinction between general and circumstantial laws, and by pointing out the absolute necessity of continued revelation growing out of the nature of the varied circumstances in which man is placed. All this stuff in blue, revelations and circumstances language from the Happiness Letter. Okay, Apostle Pratt continues in 1850. This is kind of a word salad here. Circumstantial laws are those which prohibit man from doing that which in its nature is not evil, but which, if done, circumstances would render evil, and which enjoin upon him to do that which in its nature is neither good nor evil, but which, if done, circumstances would render good. So, sum it up, moral relativism. All right, a little source here from the Prophet Joseph Smith and his history, November 1841, so shortly before the Happiness Letter, Joseph Smith Papers. Joseph says, if you will follow the revelations and instructions which God gives you through me, that's important, through me, I will take you into heaven. What many people call sin is not sin, right? Polygamy, maybe? All right, we have a discourse here from Joseph Smith on November 7th, 1841, shortly before the Happiness Letter, reported by two different people. It's reported by Wilford Woodruff, and it was also reported by Willard Richards, both in the Joseph Smith Papers. So let's go for the Wilford one first. If we did not accuse one another, and this is supposedly what Joseph is saying, if we did not accuse one another of adultery, God would not accuse us. And if we had no accuser, we should enter heaven. He would take us there as his backload. If we would not accuse him, he would not accuse us. So basically, if I, Joseph Smith, am committing adultery, having all his polygamous wives and concubines, just don't accuse me, right? If we did not accuse one another, God would not accuse us. So if we don't accuse each other and God doesn't accuse us, we can just practice adultery or polygamy. And then Willard, we know it's talking about adultery here because of Willard's account. Willard says, Joseph Smith utilized the story of the woman accused of adultery in John 8, 3 through 11, to explain that no man will be condemned before God who has no accuser. All right, same discourse here, reported by Wilford, and then the second part here is by Willard. Joseph Smith said, if we would throw a cloak of charity over Joseph's sins of adultery, I guess, he would over ours. Throw a cloak of charity over them. For charity covered a multitude of sins, and what many people called sin was not sin. Just throw a cloak of charity over Joseph's, sexual transgressions. And then Willard says, God gives laws to suit the circumstances of his creatures. Remember, that's language from the happiness letter, circumstances. Laws in themselves contradictory. Thou shalt not kill, then to Abraham, slay thy son Isaac. So that language and that idea of contradictory laws also in the happiness letter, right? Thou shalt not kill, and thou shalt kill. Abraham rendered obedience, nothing doubting, and that was virtue, perfecting his faith by works. So what is virtue according to Joseph Smith? Doing exactly what he tells you to do, no matter what it is. And usually Joseph Smith wants something out of you, right? He wants you to do something. In Nancy's case, wanting to have sex with her. All right, Revelation by Joseph Smith, December 2nd, 1841, shortly before the happiness letter, Joseph Smith Papers. Let my handmaid Nancy Miranda Hyde hearken to the counsel of my servant Joseph in all things, whatsoever he shall teach unto her. And it shall be a blessing upon her and upon her children after her, unto her justification, saith the Lord. Take the counsel of Joseph Smith in all things. She would become one of his polygamous wives, and she would be the one to introduce Nancy to polygamy. She was kind of the go-between between Joseph and Nancy. We'll get to all those accounts to show that. But there's language here in this revelation similar to the happiness letter. You must obey my counsel in all things, no matter what it is, and it's going to be a blessing to you. Okay, some information from Susan Staker, John Whitmer Historical Journal, 2021. She says Miranda was Nancy's neighbor, so that's convenient. She says Joseph is sending a longtime friend when he sends Miranda to go talk to Nancy to introduce polygamy to Nancy. They're longtime friends. He says Miranda was Joseph's recent secret wife, a secret wife. So that's interesting. Susan pictured above. All right, so now we have some strange relationships. We have some polyandry here. The biography of Orson Hyde, because Orson was actually married to Miranda Nancy Johnson as well. Orson was an apostle. Orson Hyde married Miranda Nancy Johnson in Kirtland, Ohio on September 4th, 1834. And then Joseph Smith was sealed to Miranda as a plural wife either in April 1842 or in May of 1843. We don't quite know the dates. Source for these dates is the Church History Library and the Joseph Smith Papers. So Joseph may have been sealed to Miranda as a plural wife before the happiness letter came out, if it was April 1842, and if it was the first 2 weeks in April. That might have been before, and it kind of makes more sense to send Miranda over to Nancy if she's already a wife of Joseph. But we obviously have problems here because Miranda has now 2 husbands, right? Orson Hyde, who was on a mission at this time, I think, to Jerusalem. And then she's also got Joseph Smith. Okay, so we've talked about Willard Richards being the scribe for the happiness letter. Apostle Willard Richards was appointed Joseph Smith's scribe on September 13, 1841, so shortly before the happiness letter. You can see the source for that in the Deseret News, 1858. It's interesting to note that Willard never denies the existence of the happiness letter. He would be in a position to know, right? Being the scribe, taking the whole letter down as dictated by Joseph. Okay, moving on to some more language in the happiness letter. Joseph Smith letter dictated to Nancy Rigdon in the middle of April 1842. Joseph says, if we seek first the kingdom of God, all good things will be added. So with Solomon, first he asked wisdom and gave it to him, and with it every desire of his heart. God gave Solomon every desire of his heart. Does that include sexual delights? Maybe. And yes, if you look and see how many wives Solomon had. Every desire of his heart, even things which might be considered abominable to all who do not understand the order of heaven only in part, but which in reality were right, because God gave and sanctioned by special revelation. All right, so who's Solomon? He reportedly had 700 wives and 300 concubines, right? This is how we know that the context for this letter is polygamy, right? He's talking about Solomon having all the desires of his hearts, his sexual delights, his 700 wives, his princesses, his 300 concubines. That word Solomon also shows up, in D&C 132, the Joseph Smith Revelation on polygamy. He uses the word abominable, which is a word found in the Book of Mormon relating to polygamy. Jacob 2:24 from the Book of Mormon says, "Behold, David and Solomon truly had many wives and concubines, which thing was abominable before me, saith the Lord." But now it's okay, right? So sometimes he commands it, sometimes he doesn't, right? Sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's not. In this passage in the Book of Mormon, it was abominable. But now Joseph's saying it might be considered abominable, but only to those who do not understand the order of heaven. Moses, David, Solomon, Jacob, all mentioned in D&C 132 in relationship to wives and concubines. Jacob had 2 wives plus 2 concubines. So yeah, we're finding the same kind of concepts and language both in the D&C and in the Book of Mormon and in the Happiness Letter. All right, the letter continues. Going to use some terminology, some language maybe from the Garden of Eden. Joseph says, a parent may whip a child, and justly too, because he stole an apple. Well, you talk to psychologists and stuff today, they tell you not to whip your child. It's not just. It might be in the Bible, but it's not a good way to raise your child nowadays. Whereas if the child had asked for the apple and the parent had given it, the child would have eaten it with a better appetite. There would have been no stripes. Stripes of a whip. All the pleasures of the apple would have been received, and all the misery of stealing lost. Notice the language of this apple, right? If you think of Eve in the Garden of Eden, the apple represents sin, right? In one case it's sin, and in one case maybe it's not. If you steal the apple, that's sin, but if it's given to you, given to you by Joseph, right? It's not sin. They would have eaten it with a better appetite. Sexual appetite, maybe. All of the pleasures of the apple would have been received once it's given to you by Joseph, right? The pleasures of the apple. The apple represents sin, right? So the pleasures of sin, the pleasures of sex. All right, Joseph continues with his letter to Nancy. This principle will justly apply to all of God's dealings with his children. Everything that God gives us is lawful and right, and 'tis proper that we should enjoy his gifts and blessings whenever and wherever he is disposed to bestow the blessings. But if we should seize upon these same blessings and enjoyments without law, without revelation, without commandment, those blessings and enjoyments would prove cursings. and vexations in the end, and we should have to lie down in sorrow and wailings of everlasting regret. All right, so the language here in blue, right, lawful and right, shows up in other spots. We've talked about the word revelation and commandment and cursings and blessings. All that stuff shows up in other sources, and some from Joseph Smith. 'Tis proper that we should enjoy his gifts and blessings, both Joseph and Nancy. What are the gifts and blessings? Sex, right? Having a relationship, maybe as a concubine, maybe as a wife. Gifts and blessings. But if we should seize upon these same blessings, both Joseph and Nancy, without law, these blessings and enjoyments of sex without law, without revelation, then the blessings of the sexual blessings could prove cursings. Blessings can become cursings if you don't have Joseph Smith's permission. But if you have his permission, it's fine. But if it's cursings, then we both, Joseph and Nancy, should have to lie down in sorrow and wailings of everlasting regret. So Nancy has to worry, about both of them. We and Joseph Smith having to lie down in sorrow and wailings of everlasting regret. And if she believes he's a true prophet, she wouldn't want that to happen to him, right? All right, the letter continues. It's all about obedience here. But in obedience there is joy and peace unspotted, unalloyed. And as God has designed our happiness, the happiness of all of his creatures, he never has, he never will institute an ordinance or give a commandment to his people that is not calculated in its nature to promote that happiness which he has designed, right? Biological, natural. He has designed it, and which will not end in the greatest amount of good and glory to those who become the recipients of his laws and ordinances. God has designed our happiness, the happiness of all of his creatures, right? People are happy when they're having sex. It's natural. Promoting that happiness which he has designed, right? Sex makes us happy. These relationships make us happy. All of this polygamy will end in the greatest amount of good and glory for us, right? The greatest amount of good will be accomplished through this polygamy. Is that true? Probably not. I say here, sex may make people happy in the moment, but how about polygamy for women in the long run? And even the church in their Gospel Topics essay says that polygamy in the long run doesn't lead to the greatest amount of happiness for all. Gospel Topics essay, Plural Marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo, came out October 22nd, 2014. Probably largely researched and written by Brian Hales. Maybe a few other people helped him. You can see the source for it here. In that essay, they say plural marriage was difficult for all involved. For Joseph Smith's wife, Emma, it was an excruciating ordeal. Is that really providing the greatest good for all? Probably not. All right, Jonathan Streeter did a very good presentation at Sunstone in 2019. He's pictured above here. He says, underlying all of this is the unavoidable truth that in Joseph's new religious framework, there is only one virtue, and that is obedience. All other virtues are subordinate to obedience, and obedience may trump any other virtue at any other time, allowing even extremes of murder and genocide, should God, through Joseph, command it. All right, let's continue with the letter here. Blessings offered but rejected are no longer blessings, but become like the talent hid in the earth by the wicked and slothful servant. The proffered good returns to the giver. The blessing is bestowed on those who will receive and occupy. For unto him that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundantly. But unto him that hath not, or will not receive, shall be taken away that which he hath, or might have had. So, but unto him that hath not, or will not receive, you could say polygamy, shall be taken away that which he hath, or might have had. So his that's kind of a threat of losing church blessings right there. if you don't accept and practice polygamy with Joseph. All right, Joseph Smith gives Nancy pressure to act now, like a salesman. You must act now. So back to the letter here. Be wise today, 'tis madness to defer. Next day the fatal precedent may plead. Thus on till wisdom is pushed out of time into eternity. Pressure to act now, right? It is madness to defer. You must act now. He's actually quoting some poetry from Edward Young on this one. You can see the source for this. Let's talk a little bit about Lucy Walker. This is from Mormon historian Andrew Jensen in the Historical Record 1887. Polygamy is a command of God to you, Lucy Walker. It's a command. That's language from the Happiness Letter. I will give you until tomorrow to decide this matter, if you want to become a wife of Joseph Smith. If you reject this message, the gate will be closed forever against you. Right? You got to act now, or this gate is going to be closed against you. All right, Joseph Smith presenting the carrot and the stick. Happiness Letter here. Our Heavenly Father is more liberal in his views and boundless in his mercies and blessings than we are ready to believe or receive. And at the same time, he is more terrible to the workers of iniquity, more awful in the executions of his punishments, and more ready to detect every false way than we are apt to suppose him to be. So liberal in his views, boundless in his mercies and blessings. What is this? Sex? Maybe sex outside of marriage. But then, so that's the carrot, but then you also have the stick. God can be awful. He can execute punishments. These are all threats against Nancy. So, yeah, carrot and stick. All right, let's keep reading this letter. Joseph Smith letter to Nancy Rigdon, mid-April 1842. Our Heavenly Father will be inquired of by his children. He says, ask and ye shall receive, seek and ye shall find. That's in Matthew. But if ye will take that which is not your own, Nancy, or which I have not given you. Now this is an interesting part right here. He might be saying that God has given Joseph Smith to you, Nancy, not your boyfriend, who is Francis M. Higbee. We'll get more into Francis later on. But if ye will take that which is not your own, or which I have not given you Francis, but have given you Joseph, you shall be rewarded according to your deeds, but no good thing will I withhold, maybe sex, from them who walk uprightly before me and do my will, that's God's will, in all things, including polygamy, who will listen to my voice and to the voice of my servant, whom I have sent. Joseph Smith speaks for God. For I delight in those who seek diligently to know my precepts, especially polygamy, and abide by the laws of my kingdom. My kingdom has polygamy. For all things shall be made known unto them in mine own due time, and in the end they shall have joy, and even sexual joy, right? That part in blue there, all things shall be made known unto them in mine own due time. That's also in D&C 132, verse 45. Again, that revelation on polygamy. So for Joseph, it's very important to be God's mouthpiece. He talks about this in D&C 138 as well. Though the heavens and the earth pass away, the Lord's word shall not pass away, but shall all be fulfilled, whether by mine own voice, God's, or by the voice of my servants, Joseph, it is the same. All right, some of the apologetics now from the Joseph Smith papers. Where did they put this letter from Joseph to Nancy? Well, they put it into an appendix in the documents volume, volume number 9. Why did they put it in the appendix? Not as many people will read it if they're reading the physical copy of the book, right? If it's in the appendix. Online, it doesn't really matter as much because you just do a search and this thing comes right up. They're the ones that dated this, mid-April 1842. This is from the historical introduction, Joseph Smith Papers, the historical introduction to this letter. So the editors, I guess, for this Documents Volume 9 say, because Joseph Smith's authorship of this letter, the happiness letter, is uncertain, the authorship of the letter is uncertain, the letter is presented as an appendix to this volume. Stick it back in the appendix, rather than a featured document. It's not featured. Why would they try to hide this, right? All right, back to Susan Staker, independent researcher. She points something out again in her article in the John Whitmer Journal. She's talking about Gary James Bergera. She says Gary Bergera, pictured above, argues that publishing the letter in the appendix is a problem since it unnecessarily undermines the letter as a Joseph text. Why does the church and the Joseph Smith Papers want to undermine the letter as a Joseph text? Is it a little bit controversial of a letter? I guess she gets the source for this from Bergera's Joseph Smith Papers and Plural Marriage, Joseph Smith Papers Conference, 2019. All right, Joseph Smith Papers editors, Hedges, Smith, and Anderson. Introduction to the Journals, Volume 2. Given the nature of the evidence, it is not certain that such a proposal from Joseph to Nancy was even made in the first place. No, that's not true. We're going to show a lot of evidence for that in the upcoming slides. We've already shown a lot of evidence that the ideas and language in the happiness letter show up in a lot of other sources by Joseph Smith, by other apostles, etc. We'll show more. All right, same editors here in the Journals, Volume 2. A couple of them are pictured above. I think that's Hedges and Anderson. They say the happiness letter can be read in light of plural marriage without requiring it to refer to a proposal to Nancy. We're going to show a lot of evidence that that's not true. And given its emphasis on the blessings following obedience, may even have its origins in an issue altogether unrelated to plural marriage. No. I went over all that evidence for Solomon and all that stuff. It's pretty dang clear what the context is. The church just doesn't like this letter. All right, Joseph Smith Papers editors, historical introduction to this letter, happiness letter. Because contemporaneous evidence discredits other allegations in Bennett's Sangamo Journal letters and in his subsequent book, History of the Saints, which appeared in early November 1842, some debate exists among historians about the authenticity of this purported Joseph Smith letter. One of those historians is Garrett Dirkmaat. I'm not sure how to say his name. He's pictured above here. He did an article, I think in the Journal of Mormon History, trying to discredit the provenance of this letter. We have a lot of other sources to back up Bennett, which we'll go over. But yeah, maybe some of the stuff he did in his letters was not accurate. Maybe some of the stuff in his book, History of the Saints, is not accurate. I'll point out some of that stuff as we go along. But I think the general outlines and most of the information he gives about Nancy is accurate, and he is backed up by a lot of other sources and people. The original manuscript of the happiness letter is missing. That is true. Garrett is right about that. The first copy, or the first printed edition we had of it, was in the Sangamo Journal. We do not have the original. All right, let's talk a little bit about Dan Vogel, the preeminent historian on Joseph Smith. Little footnote here in his new book, Charisma Under Pressure, which came out in 2023. He talks about Garrett J. Dirkmaat, who is a BYU professor. He says Dirkmaat has questioned Joseph Smith's authorship of the letter to Nancy Rigdon. And then Vogel says, however, I find his arguments unconvincing. Garrett's arguments are unconvincing. That tells you that Vogel believes that the happiness letter is real and is authored by Joseph Smith. I already showed a lot of evidence to prove that. I'll show more. Garrett was an editor for the Joseph Smith papers. Church probably wanted him to write this article to try to get Joseph Smith off the hook here. All right, these editors in the historical introduction again say that although this particular letter's authenticity is contested, really shouldn't be, Joseph Smith both wrote and offered to write similar letters of explanation about the principle of plural marriage to other prospective spouses. Yeah, a lot of similarities. We've gone over some. All right, Joseph Smith editors, historical introduction to the letter again. Aside from the version in the New York Herald, which included Joseph Smith as the signer and Rigdon as the recipient, none of the 1842 printed versions or later handwritten copies based on them include a signature, address, or date. Of course, Joseph Smith didn't want to sign this. He was trying to keep all of his plural wives secret. There would be no address on it either, because the letter was simply dictated to Willard Richards and handed directly to Nancy. No need for an address. Why didn't it have a date? Probably Joseph Smith's secrecy again. All right, back to Susan Staker. Joseph Smith never directly spoke to a you in the letter, never to Nancy. Certainly such indirection, where there's no addressee, not addressed to Nancy, no direct reference to its controversial subject, but you can definitely figure it out. She says all of this is a hallmark of Nauvoo texts, especially Joseph's. So it's normal not to have these things. Didn't want to address it to Nancy. That he wants to keep that secret. Trying not to directly reference polygamy, but you can still figure it out. Maybe it gives him a little bit of deniability. This is all normal. All right, the editors continue. No documentary evidence exists for a marriage between Joseph Smith and Nancy Rigdon. That's true. Nancy turned him down. All right, some more information. From 1920 through the 2000s, the happiness letter was quoted at least 34 times in General Conference. This is from the LDS General Conference Corpus. You can see the address for it here online. 34 times, and they usually just quote that first part, right? Happiness is the object and design of our existence, without really knowing the context. The latest quote appears to be a September 2017 talk by Apostle Jeffrey R. Holland. You can see the title of that here. Holland attributes the quote, happiness is the object and design of our existence, to Joseph Smith. Attributes it to Joseph Smith, as probably most people do in these talks. Such attributions in General Conference started in 1955. That's when they first started saying, yeah, this statement is from Joseph Smith. And then I asked the question, did any general authority say that such quotes were not by Joseph Smith? Nope, never. They all just assumed that it was Joseph, and if they have the gift of discernment, they should have known, right? They're reading these quotes, and that can't be from Joseph. That just sounds too far out there, right? Or having some discernment or having some revelation. But they didn't. Then I say, hopefully they were not quoting John C. Bennett. I think as Garrett likes to insinuate that Bennett maybe wrote the letter, not Joseph Smith. If that's the case, all these general authorities are quoting John C. Bennett, the apostate, in General Conference at least 34 times, and there's more than that too. I don't think that corpus picked up everything, because I have some that are outside of that. So Holland quoted this in 2017. Then I asked the question, will leaders ever reference this letter again in General Conference now that all this controversial context has come out, now that the Joseph Smith papers have been released? I kind of have a feeling the Correlation Committee is not going to want this quoted in conference much anymore. All right, so here's one example of an apostle quoting this letter. This shows up in the Improvement era in 1920, so this is one of the earlier ones. I don't think this was in General Conference, though. So David O. McKay went on to be the prophet. He says, when Joseph Smith taught a doctrine, he taught it authoritatively. His was not a question whether his thoughts agreed with men's thoughts or not, or the prevailing standards of mankind. If the prevailing standards say the adultery is wrong, Joseph Smith doesn't really have to go along with that. In his own words, in Joseph Smith's own words, according to McKay, it is this: whatever God requires is right, no matter what it is, although we may not see the reason thereof until long after the events transpire. And I could go through all of these if I wanted to. There'd be tons of these apostles, probably some prophets, probably some 70s, all quoting this letter. All right, so let's talk about the church printing this letter. The first time it was printed, was in the Sangamo Journal. But when was the first time the church printed it? Well, that was in the Deseret News in 1855. You can see the date here. Then it was published in the Millennial Star, a church newspaper over in England, I think, in 1857. Then it was printed in the History of the Church, Volume 5, in 1909, where the Mormon historian and 70 B.H. Roberts accepted the letter as genuine. The Apostle George A. Smith supervised the writing of this history, Volume 5. They're accepting the letter as coming from Joseph Smith. Then it was printed in the Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, a very popular book in the church, put out by Apostle Joseph Fielding Smith in 1938. All seems pretty official, right? All right. Bruce R. McConkie also quotes from this happiness letter in Mormon Doctrine. Probably the most popular book on Mormon doctrine ever released in the church. First came out in 1958. He's quoting from the Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith by his father-in-law, Joseph Fielding Smith. McConkie quotes from it, and he says, the prophet Joseph Smith said, and then he gives this quote from the letter. All right, so what do other historians think, even Mormon historians? What about Dean C. Jesse, pictured above? He was an archivist, editor, and historian, as well as an authority on early Mormon handwriting. In his book, Personal Writings of Joseph Smith, he seems to accept the letter as authentic. He says, among the writings published by Bennett during the time was an authentic statement by Joseph Smith, which was the happiness letter. All right, what does Fawn Brody have to say in No Man Knows My History, 1945? She's pictured above. Since Joseph Smith's courtship of Nancy was described by her brother John and her brother-in-law George W. Robinson, as well as by John C. Bennett, there is no reason for doubting the story. Joseph made the mistake of dictating a letter to Nancy. Happiness is the object and design of our existence. We're going to go through all those statements by John, the brother, and the brother-in-law, George W. Robinson. Of course, all the stuff from John C. Bennett. We'll go over all that. All right, Fawn Brody continues. The letter was perhaps the first forthright argument for polygamy that Joseph Smith ever put to paper. I think there was a couple other things, too, that showed up in the Joseph Smith papers that we've gone over. But Fawn didn't have the Joseph Smith papers. Nancy showed it to her father, Sidney Rigdon, who until now had apparently been completely ignorant of polygamy, and told him of Joseph's advances. Wild with fury, Sidney Rigdon sent for him, Joseph, at once. Okay, a little bit of information from Newell and Avery's book, Mormon Enigma, 1984. Great book. By the spring of 1842, John C. Bennett's political power in Nauvoo was almost as great as Joseph's. In 18 months, he had become Major General of the Nauvoo Legion, President of the Agricultural and Manufacturing Association, Chancellor of the proposed university in Nauvoo, Mayor of the city, and de facto counselor to Joseph, as Sidney Rigdon was too ill to function. John C. Bennett was in a position to know things. All right, another little tidbit from Gary James Bergera, article in the Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society, 2003. We're going to quote more from it later on, too. Some poetry by Francis Higbee, Buckeye's Laments. So Bergera says, Bennett had lodged with Joseph Smith and had enjoyed an intimate association with the prophet during this period on April 5th, 1841. So about a year before the happiness letter. Smith took his first plural wife, an event to which John C. Bennett was privy. Okay, some information from Donna Hill in her book, Joseph Smith, the First Mormon, 1977. I don't think this is that great of a book, but sometimes I use it. So Donna says, John C. Bennett was a man of proven ability, intelligent and well-educated, with an attractive vitality. He won the admiration of men as well as women. He attended Athens State University and studied medicine, and later practiced in Ohio and states nearby. At Willoughby, Ohio, he organized the medical school and was the first dean and professor of gynecology and children's diseases. There was evidence that he served as a surgeon in the Black Hawk War. Important guy, right? Probably a good leader. He had all this medical knowledge. Some of the rumors about him is that he was able to use that knowledge to give people abortions, maybe even to some of Joseph Smith's wives. Okay, some information from the historian Richard S. Van Wagner, who my mom knew pretty well. In his book, Sidney Rigdon, A Portrait of Religious Excess, 1994, good historian, he says, in Orthodox Mormon circles, Bennett was a scabby opportunist who tried to camouflage his own sexual adventures. So if you look at some of the apologetics for this whole issue, they basically pick on Bennett, but there's a lot of other sources besides Bennett. Yet much of what Bennett wrote about Mormonism's inner circles was factual. As a member of the First Presidency, he was clearly in a privileged position to witness much of Joseph's personal behavior. Okay, some information from Mark Tensmeyer. He's an attorney, did a chapter in a book that just came out called Secret Covenants, New Insights on Early Mormon Polygamy 2024. I think that's Signature Books, edited by Cheryl L. Bruno. Tensmeyer did chapter 2. He says, most historians accept what George W. Robinson and John C. Bennett wrote largely at face value. That's most historians. Their accounts likely contain exaggerations, but a number of factors lend credence to the core narrative, including John W. Rigdon, Nancy's younger brother, later confirming the basic story. Okay, let's talk about Lawrence Foster, professor of American history at Georgia Institute of Technology. Put out a book called Women, Family, and Utopia, 1991. Foster says the happiness letter is acknowledged by Latter-day Saints as coming from Joseph Smith. We gave all those sources for that, which can all but conclusively be identified as a letter sent from Joseph Smith to Nancy Rigdon, all but conclusively, pressing his suit to her after she had initially rejected his overtures. Okay, Professor Foster continues, the happiness letter appears beyond reasonable doubt to have been sent to Nancy Rigdon by Joseph Smith after she had refused his proposal of marriage. Okay, some information about William Law, a member of the First Presidency from 1841 to 1844. So technically, he was a member of the First Presidency, I guess, at the time of the happiness letter. This information comes from T.B.H. Stenhouse, Rocky Mountain Saints book, 1873. I think a pretty good book. So William Law says, I believe now that John C. Bennett did know about polygamy in the church, for he at the time was more in the secret confidence of Joseph than perhaps any other man in the city. And William Law pictured above. He later would put out the Nauvoo Expositor, which exposed Joseph Smith's polygamy to the public. Okay, another statement in the Joseph Smith Papers history draft, right around this time frame. It says, a conspiracy against the peace of Joseph Smith's household was made manifest, and it gave me some trouble to counteract the designs of certain base individuals like Bennett and restore peace. This also showed up in Joseph Smith's Journal, April 29th, 1842, so just a couple weeks after the happiness letter was written. Joseph says, was made manifest a conspiracy against the peace of Joseph Smith's household. And then there was the initials JCB, John C. Bennett, later inserted in the journal by Willard Richards. Okay, so John C. Bennett, not an angel by any means. This is from Wikipedia. John C. Bennett was excommunicated for adultery on May 11th, 1842, shortly after this happiness letter incident. I think that is true. Rumors of adultery, homosexuality, and unauthorized polygamy emerged. Yeah, probably adultery and polygamy or spiritual wifery. The homosexuality, probably not. While Bennett was mayor, he was caught in a private sexual relations with women in the city. Hey, just like Joseph. Okay, I don't think we're exactly sure when John C. Bennett was excommunicated or his name withdrawn from the church. There's a source here that said his name was withdrawn May 17th, 1842. Also, there are other reliable sources that Bennett was excommunicated on June 18, 1842, but all these are fairly soon after the whole happiness letter incident. All right, John C. Bennett was married to Mary A. Barker. They divorced in October 1842. They had 3 children. I think he did cheat on her. I think he was involved in the whole spiritual wifery thing. It sounds like Bennett did admit to some of the spiritual wifery stuff. This is the Cleveland Plain Dealer, April 24th, 1844, so about 2 years after the happiness letter came out. Bennett had commenced by giving with remarkable candor and plainness the history of his amour with a gentle princess of Nauvoo. The Mormons, however, he declared were themselves guilty of the very sin for which they had excommunicated him, certainly of Joseph Smith. All right, so once Sidney Rigdon found out that Joseph Smith approached Nancy, his daughter, Sidney Rigdon wasn't very happy. This information comes from D. Michael Quinn. You can see the book here, Origins of Power. He says, on May 4th, 1842, so about 2 weeks after the happiness letter, the 2 men were sufficiently estranged that Joseph Smith excluded Sidney Rigdon from the Holy Order of the Holy Priesthood, or the endowment. That's temple work, right? Rigdon got excluded 2 weeks later. All right, let's go to Joseph Smith's journal, May 12th, 1842, so about a month after the happiness letter. Joseph says, dictated a letter to President Rigdon, Sidney Rigdon, concerning certain difficulties or surmises which existed. What were these difficulties? I think the next slide will kind of explain more. Apparently, this letter that he's talking about here has not been found. It's not in the Joseph Smith papers. All right, so the day after, Joseph Smith elaborates. This is in his journal, May 13, 1842, Joseph Smith papers. Received an answer from Sidney Rigdon, I guess an answer to his letter, after a variety of current business. Walked in the evening to the post office with the recorder, who was Willard Richards, and had a private interview with President Rigdon. Remember, he's in the First Presidency. With much apparent satisfaction to all parties concerning certain evil reports put in circulation by Francis M. Higbee about President Rigdon's family and others, after which the recorder waited on him to his gate. Francis was Nancy's 23-year-old boyfriend at the time. She was 19. Francis was 23. According to this, Francis had put in certain evil reports about President Rigdon's family. What were that? What was that? It was probably Joseph Smith approaching Nancy, right? Francis joined in 1844, a couple years after the Happiness Letter, with other dissidents in publishing the Nauvoo Expositor, with William Law. A little more information about John C. Bennett. This is in some minutes, May 19th, 1842, so about a month after the Happiness Letter came out. Joseph Smith Papers. The city recorder, which remember is Willard Richards. The city recorder produced and read John C. Bennett's resignation of the office of mayor of the city. Bennett had to resign as mayor of Nauvoo, I guess, which was unanimously accepted. So here's all the fallout, right? Trouble with Rigdon, Sidney Rigdon, trouble with his family, trouble with Bennett. All right, a poem by Eliza R. Snow called The Tattler. It was in the Wasp newspaper, June 11, 1842, so about 2.5 months after the Happiness Letter. Snow became a secret plural wife of Joseph Smith, sealed to him on June 29, 1842. That'd be about 3 months after the Happiness Letter. So Snow, I think, is going to be talking here about Nancy, and maybe some others. She says, "It has been said by some that woman's soul should never hate. But one character I almost dare to hate." Nancy, maybe? A tattler? "And even in this age of effeminacy, is there who would think that woman should not hate? The tattler," maybe Nancy Rigdon, maybe Martha Brotherton, maybe some others. "The tattler whose unhallowed business seems to wake up nonsense and to stir up strife." So these accusations against Joseph Smith, right? They're nonsense, just people wanting to stir up strife. All right, Snow continues. She gets very mean here to Nancy and maybe some of the others that she's talking about, tattlers. "Poor brainless skull." No brain in your skull. "Wretched propensity, and wretched the possessor of this execrable vice, whose soul, if soul is there at all, must be unto non-entity so near allied as to require a microscopic power to swell it into visibility." If soul is there at all, maybe Nancy doesn't have a soul. She's accusing the Lord's anointed, right? No brain, no soul. Soul is a non-entity. You got to have a microscope to see it. All right, let's get to the story as told by John C. Bennett about what happened here between Joseph and Nancy. This is about 2.5 months after the fact. John C. Bennett in the Sangamo Journal. Remember, he was the former assistant president of the church. Kind of on the outs now, though, with Joseph, after having blowing the lid off of some things, being a whistleblower and putting out his book, History of the Saints. So anyway, Bennett says, Joseph Smith, the great Mormon seducer, one who has seduced not only hundreds of single and married females, but more than the great Solomon. Remember, Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. He says Joseph had more. He's exaggerating. Attempted to seduce Miss Nancy Rigdon, Joseph did, the eldest single daughter of Sidney Rigdon, to submit to his hellish purposes and become one of his clandestine wives under this new dispensation. He says Joseph Smith seduced hundreds of single and married females. We know that he married between 35 and 40 that we have record of, 35 to 40 wives. How many do we not know about? All right, John C. Bennett continues here. Call upon Miss Rigdon, who repulsed Joseph with commendable firmness, and I will abide her testimony. Call likewise upon General George W. Robinson and Colonel Francis M. Higbee to state what they know about the subject. General Robinson and Colonel Higbee can tell some astounding facts in relation to the matter, Joseph Smith approached Miss Rigdon in the name of the Lord and by his authority and permission, as he said. Robinson was Nancy Rigdon's brother-in-law. He was married to Sidney Rigdon's daughter, Athalia. And Robinson knew about all this. Francis Higbee knew about all this too. Francis was Nancy's boyfriend, as we already mentioned. Okay, Bennett continues. Joseph Smith attacked Mr. Rigdon, General Robinson, and Colonel Francis Higbee, and myself, Bennett. He attacked them all to destroy the influence of all of us to prevent the exposition of this case, but it is all true, and the legal evidence shall be forthcoming. That's kind of what the Sangamo Journal looked like. It's not this exact article, but... Okay, the very next day, after that article came out, Joseph Smith wrote in his journal, June 28, 1842, Joseph Smith Papers. So in Joseph's journal, he says, President Joseph Smith, in company with Bishop George Miller, visited Elder Sidney Rigdon and his family and had much conversation about John C. Bennett and others. What were they talking about? Nancy, right? Much unpleasant feeling was manifested by Elder Rigdon's family. Unpleasant feeling, yeah. Doesn't like Joseph going after Nancy, a man of 37 going after a 19-year-old. But then they say, and this is Joseph writing, or his scribe, Elder Rigdon's family were confounded and put to silence by the truth from President Joseph Smith. What did Joseph Smith say? What was his truth? All right, 2 days later, June 30, 1842, Francis M. Higbee, boyfriend of Nancy, gave a sworn statement that Joseph Smith told him that John C. Bennett could be easily put aside or drowned, and no person would be the wiser for it, and that it ought to be attended to. Let's just drown Bennett. That'll get rid of our troubles, right? This is also in the Sangamo Journal, shows up July 15th, 1842. All right, just a couple days later, President Sidney Rigdon sends a letter to Joseph Smith, July 1st, 1842, Joseph Smith Papers. So they're going to, feelings are definitely hurt. They're going to kind of go back and forth between love and hate, between Sidney and Joseph. So Sidney says, Dear brother Joseph, he's talking to, I, Sidney, write this in the greatest confidence to yourself, Joseph, and for your own eye and none other, and so let it be and known assuredly that I will not have a quarrel or any dispute with you, nor must not have with me. For in the name of the Holy One of Israel, I am your friend and not your enemy, as I am afraid that you suppose. So Sidney's worried that Joseph Smith is now kind of thinking of Sidney as an enemy. All right, so just a couple days later, there's some information in Bennett's book, History of the Saints. This is from General George W. Robinson, a letter to John C. Bennett, July 3rd, 1842. Robinson was also the former secretary to the First Presidency, so he probably heard about some stuff about polygamy in that role. Let's see. Robinson says, Sir, the Sangamo Journal came in today. I expected something from you, but was disappointed, but presume that you knew nothing of the new arrangement of the males. I just saw Colonel Chauncey L. Higbee and saw the affidavit of Miss Melissa Schindel. Good. And we'll get more into Schindel. All right, Robinson continues. The letter to Nancy, Miss Nancy Rigdon, Colonel Chauncey L. Higbee will get. Francis M. Higbee has it. And I guess this is the happiness letter. And I told him to get it. I will leave this for the present and await the return. I will await the return of our folks from meeting, before I seal it, unless the mail should come before they return. Okay, Robinson continues. Remember, he's married to Sidney Rigdon's oldest daughter, Athalia, as well. 2 o'clock, our folks have returned from meeting, and the way that Joe took back what he said about us. Joseph Smith took back what he said about us was a caution. He said that he had agreed to take back what was said, but on thinking it over, he could not do it, for any man that would suffer Bennett to come into their houses was just as bad as he. So he's trying to isolate Bennett now. And he would, however, say this much, that one continued course of rascality in Mr. Rigdon and myself, Rigdon and Robinson are being rascals, for some time back was the cause of Joseph Smith coming out on us, and if that would be any satisfactory confession, we could have that much and do what we pleased. Okay, Robinson continues. July 3rd, 1842. This account, remembers, in Bennett's book, History of the Saints. Joseph Smith said that whenever he exposed iniquity, the persons chastised would turn around and endeavor to injure him. Now he says, look out, look out. These men, I will venture to say, will come out on me. Robinson, the Higbees, Bennett, they're going to come out on me with all of their power and say and do all they can to put me down. But do not believe one word of their cursed lies, for I know that I am a prophet. All right, Robinson continues. Joseph Smith soaped over Ivans, Hunter, and Pierce. He soaped over them, whatever that means. And I think some have already consecrated. Law of consecration, maybe? And quite likely the balance will. Joseph Smith did not say much about Higbee, and we don't know if that's Francis or Chauncey. Joseph Smith did not say much about Higbee. He stated that a young man came down to see him the other day and wanted to know why he came out on him, but says he, I have settled all matters with him and shall not mention his name, for he confessed his sins to me and begged that I would not mention him. It says it's a young man. I'm not sure which one is older, Francis or Chauncey. Francis is 24. All right, the very next day, July 4th, 1842, we have a letter from Chauncey Higbee to John C. Bennett. Chauncey was aide-de-camp, confidential assistant to John C. Bennett, General John C. Bennett. This letter is also in History of the Saints, Bennett's book, just one day after the last account. Dear Sir, and this is Chauncey, I received your favor. He's talking about the happiness letter, maybe. I received your favor by Mr. Hamilton today, and have done all in my power to accomplish your business according to your request. I have talked with Miss G, we don't know who that is, and labored hard to show her the necessity of coming out to befriend the innocent, maybe Nancy, and defend her own character from Joe's foul aspersions. But she says that she will not give her affidavit now, but thinks that she will in the course of 2 or 3 days. All right, Chauncey continues. Mrs. G wants to have a talk with Apostle Orson Pratt before she gives her affidavit. I have seen Pratt, and he says that if she comes to talk with him, he will tell her that if she knows anything to tell it, let it hit where it will. So let's bring out the affidavits, right? There's some more context here. Joseph Smith was accused of asking Pratt's wife, Sarah, to marry him. Both John C. Bennett and Sarah told Orson about the proposal. I don't think Orson was very happy. Orson was excommunicated over the issue on August 20th, 1842. Sarah pictured above. All right, Chauncey L. Higbee continues. July 4th, 1842. There were a great many people out to meeting today, or yesterday. Joseph Smith preached, and he said considerable against Bennett, and stated that George W. Robinson and Sidney Rigdon had requested him to recall what he had said against them, but instead of doing it according to promise, he vilified them worse than ever. That's Bennett, Robinson, and Rigdon. Joseph Smith vilified them. No other names were mentioned, but he insinuated very hard on Francis M. Higbee in the forenoon and on myself, Chauncey, in the afternoon. He insinuated very hard on both of the Higbees by saying that those who had resigned were no better than Bennett, after placing you at the lowest grade that he possibly could. That's Bennett, in his awkward way of doing it. Okay, Chauncey continues here. I have seen Nancy Rigdon. She told me to say to you, that's Bennett, go ahead and make of her name as much as you please in relating the circumstances which happened between Joseph Smith and herself. The proposal from Joseph to Nancy. Mr. Orson Pratt and his wife, Sarah, say that if ever Smith renews the attack on them, they will come out against him and stand it no longer. So you have all these people. Got the Pratts, the Higbees, Robinson, Bennett. They've all kind of ganged up on Joseph here in relation to polygamy. Okay, let's move on to another account. Just a couple days later, Francis Higbee, a letter to John C. Bennett, July 6, 1842, also in Bennett's book, History of the Saints. Joseph Smith is yet thrashing about, tearing up the D and slandering everybody. I'm not sure what the D is. Tearing up the D, star, 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 star. Joseph thrashing about. He has not lit on Sidney Rigdon and George W. Robinson very severely as yet, but he touched them lightly on Sunday. Also, myself, Francis, he touched on. We must keep things right side up. Pictured above Joseph Smith, as according to AI. A lot of these pictures in here are AI. Okay, Francis continues here. Letter to John C. Bennett, July 6, 1842. A Miss Melissa Schindel gave an affidavit, and it is a good one. And Miss G, I have understood, was going to give her affidavit. Miss Sarah Pratt, I think, will also give an affidavit. That's Orson Pratt, the apostle's wife. Also, Miss Nancy Rigdon may give an affidavit. Joseph Smith, is operating with Miss White, and it is reported that he is to settle upon her a fine sum soon, or return the money that he and Sherman took from Bill White some time ago. Not sure what that's for. Is that to keep her quiet, maybe? So she doesn't give an affidavit? Not sure. Melissa Schindel gave her affidavit on July 2nd, 1842. You can see the source here in the Sangamo Journal. Melissa claimed that Joseph Smith was trying to have sex with her. Familiar story. All right, Francis continues here in his letter. I, Francis, am yet true as death and intend to stick or die, but you must keep my name back because I am not ready as yet to leave. And as soon as you bring my name out, they are certain to take my life. That's scary. They go it like hell, yet I am likely to sell my property here, and as soon as I do, I will immigrate like lightning. Orson or Sarah Pratt is true. I'm not sure which one it is, Orson or Sarah. Sidney or Nancy Rigdon is good. So a Pratt is true, and a Rigdon is good. Not sure which ones those are, though. Okay, an account here from the Apostle John E. Page. Don't hear much about him. Undated letter, probably in July of 1842, Joseph Smith collection. Apostle Page says, the disclosures of Bennett has done much to injure the cause of the kingdom. Here the people are anxiously looking for the full and effectual downfall of Mormonism, through a Judas of a Bennett. A Judas of a Bennett. The people believe that Bennett is a villain and effectually exposing villains, like Joseph Smith. But the thinking public are looking for Sidney Rigdon and his daughter Nancy, Orson Pratt and his wife, Sarah, the Higbees and others to finish the work of death to Mormonism. Finish the work of death. And kind of a little painting here of Apostle Page, who you never hear anything about. All right, so the church started to call Bennett every name in the book that they could think of. This is in the WASP Extra newspaper, July 17th, 1842. Bennett was stripped of his Mormon power base and accused in the church press of deviant acts, including adultery, probably true, fornication, probably true, abortion, probably true, and buggery. What's buggery? Bestiality or sodomy. Those probably not true, in my opinion. And we have a goat pictured above. Okay, some more information from Richard Van Wagner, Mormon Polygamy, a History Book, 1986, pictured above. Richard says a Mormon newspaper, The Wasp, printed on July 20 a number of sworn statements by prominent Nauvoo citizens affirming Joseph Smith's high moral character and declaring him not guilty of any of Bennett's published accusations. Orson Pratt would not sign the letter. Neither would Sidney Rigdon or George W. Robinson. Rigdon and Robinson would not sign the letter. So, like I said, there's this group of people that are kind of against polygamy and against Joseph at this time, although Orson and Sidney kind of go in and out of the church. Okay, Van Wagner continues. A public meeting was called on July 22, 1842, to obtain an expression of the public mind in reference to the reports gone abroad defaming the character of President Joseph Smith. Okay, Van Wagner continues. He's pictured above. Might be Times Square or somewhere there. A resolution was presented by Wilson Law, brother of William Law, and published in the August 1st, 1842 Times and Seasons church newspaper, which declared that having heard that John C. Bennett was circulating many base falsehoods respecting a number of the citizens of Nauvoo, and especially against our worthy and respected mayor, Joseph Smith, we do hereby manifest to the world that so far as we know, Joseph is a good, moral, virtuous, peaceable, and patriotic man. Okay, Van Wagner continues with the story here. The Nauvoo saints must have been shocked when 2 or 3 persons, including the Apostle Orson Pratt, voted against the proposed resolution, that Joseph was such a great man. The minutes of the meeting do not record Pratt's explanation for his vote, but as soon as he finished speaking, Joseph Smith jumped to his feet and said to Pratt, Have you personally a knowledge of any immoral act in me towards the female sex or in any other way? Personally towards the female sex, Pratt replied, I have not. Not personally. Maybe didn't I witness it? Pratt elaborated, but his comments were, again, not recorded. Those comments would be nice to have, but we don't have them. Pratt pictured above. All right, Van Wagner continues in his book, Mormon Polygamy. Came out in 1986, very good book. Addressing the saints on August 25th, Joseph Smith admonished the 12 apostles, and others to support the character of the prophet, the Lord's anointed. He lashed out at Orson Pratt and others of the same class, Robinson, Rigdon, the Higbees, others of the same class, who caused trouble by telling stories to people who would betray me. And they must believe these stories because his wife told him so. Orson Pratt's wife, Sarah, pictured above in her older days. Orson's believing his wife, not Joseph. Who would you believe? I'd be a lot more likely to believe my wife. All right, Van Wagner continues, and Joseph Smith says, and as to all that Orson Pratt, Sidney Rigdon, or George W. Robinson can do to prevent me, the prophet concluded, I can kick them off my heels. As many as you can name. I can just kick them off my heels. That's a statement from the manuscript History, August 29th, 1842. All right, so July 25th, 1842, Sidney Rigdon's trying to get back onto Joseph Smith's good side for whatever reason. This is the certificate of Sidney Rigdon, shows up in the Times and Seasons, August 1st, 1842. As there seems to be some foolish notions that I have been engaged with John C. Bennett in the difficulties between him and some of the citizens of this place, I merely say in reply to such idle and vain reports that they are without foundation in truth. Okay, a couple days later, George W. Robinson writes a letter to General James Arlington Bennett. Not sure who that is. It's not John C. Bennett. It's James Arlington Bennett. July 27, 1842. Letter is in History of the Saints book by Bennett. So Robinson says, Joseph Smith and John C. Bennett have always been on very friendly terms and were together a great deal, and I have no doubt but that Bennett was Smith's confidant in nearly all things. So he'd know about polygamy, right? Okay, Robinson continues. Joseph Smith enjoined secrecy on Bennett. Don't tell people about my plural marriages. As also on the females to whom he made known his desires and doctrine. The females that Joseph Smith approached to be his wives, they were also enjoined to secrecy. Didn't always work, right? Nancy spilled the beans. Martha Brotherton spilled the beans. He made known his desires and doctrine, right? Whatever I say is right. General Bennett states that Joseph Smith offered him $500 or his choice in town lots on Main Street if Bennett would succeed in getting Joseph, Mr. Rigdon's daughter, for a spiritual wife. Which daughter was it? It was Nancy. Okay, Robinson continues. A letter to James Arlington Bennett, July 27. Bennett utterly refused to have anything to do with the matter, trying to get Nancy for a wife for Joseph, for $500, and cautioned Smith against such an attempt. Joseph Smith said, "You are my enemy," etc. Bennett says to Smith, "If you go there, you will get into trouble." But Joseph Smith, it seems, persisted and was determined to succeed in all of his undertakings. All right, Robinson continues. Joseph Smith sent for Nancy to come to the house of Miss Hyde. That's Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde, who lived in the under rooms of the printing office with Willard Richards, by the way. Mrs. Hyde's husband was on a mission to Jerusalem. So she was living with Willard, and there was a lot of talk that they were kind of hooking up. And then Mrs. Hyde would also marry Joseph, so it becomes kind of crazy. Miss Nancy Rigdon inquired of the messenger, Mrs. Hyde, who came for her, what was wanting. She was the go-between. And the only reply was that Joseph Smith wanted to see her. All right, Robinson continues. General Bennett came to Miss Rigdon and cautioned her, that's Nancy Rigdon, and advised her not to place too much reliance on revelation. So Nancy was forewarned. I think that's one of the reasons she became such a badass. She was forewarned and was kind of expecting something from Joseph. But Bennett did not enlighten Nancy on the object of Joseph Smith, but advised her to go down to Miss Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde's and see Smith. Miranda was also a trusted friend of the Rigdon family. All right, we now get to the juicy part here. Same source here. George W. Robinson, July 27, 1842. Nancy accordingly went, and Smith took her into another room and locked the door and then stated to her that he had had an affection for her for several years and wished that she should be his, that the Lord was well pleased with the matter, for he had gotten a revelation on the subject, of course he did, and God had given him all the blessings of Jacob. Remember, Jacob had 2 wives and 2 concubines. And that there was no sin in it whatever, but if she had any scruples of conscience about the matter, about just kind of hooking up and being a concubine, if she had scruples about that, Joseph Smith would marry her privately and enjoin her to secrecy. Just do a couple words and plop, a couple vows. Oh, now you're married. Is it really that much different than being a concubine? So yeah, it's disturbing. Joseph Smith is locking the door here. This is not the only time this happened. John C. Bennett also said that Martha Brotherton was locked in a room. That's in the Sangamo Journal. There are similar stories about Mary Dawson in the book called Mormon Portraits about being locked up in a room, and also similar stories in an affidavit from Joseph A. Kelting, March 1st, 1894. So it's kind of a pattern here. Okay, Robinson continues. Nancy repulsed him, and was about to raise the neighbors, basically yell over to the neighbors, if Joseph did not unlock the door and let her out, and she left him with disgust and came home and told her father Sidney of the transaction, upon which Smith was sent for. Joseph Smith came. She told the tale in the presence of all the family, I guess, of the Rigdon family. So there's a lot of people that knew about this. And to Smith's face. She told the tale to Smith's face. I was present. That's George W. Robinson. He's saying he was there. He was present. He was an eyewitness. Okay, Robinson continues. Joseph Smith attempted to deny everything at first and faced Nancy down with the lie, but she told the facts with so much earnestness, and the fact of a letter being present. What was this letter? The happiness letter, which he had caused to be written to her on the same subject the day after the attempt made on her virtue, breathing the same spirit, and which he had fondly hoped was destroyed, but it was not. I think she was told to burn it. All came with such force that he could not withstand the testimony. That was Joseph, that was, and he then and there acknowledged that every word of Miss Rigdon's testimony was true. This is all according to Robinson, who was there. Okay, Robinson continues. Now for Joseph Smith's excuse, which he made for such a base attempt, and for using the name of the Lord in vain on that occasion. Joseph Smith said that he wished to ascertain whether Nancy was virtuous or not, and took that course to learn the facts. So it was a test, right? And like an Abrahamic test. I was just testing her virtue, right? All right, so we're going to finally finish up this letter by Robinson. I would say, sir, that I have reason to believe General Bennett's story in his disclosures of Smith's rascality, although I am not a witness to all of the facts, yet I am to some. I'd like to have forgotten to state that the affair with Miss Rigdon was the cause of Smith's coming out so on Bennett, he having suspicions that Bennett had cautioned her on the matter, which he did, and he was further afraid that Bennett would make disclosures of other matters, because Bennett knew a lot more than just this, right? Okay, let's move on to another account here. This is also by General George W. Robinson, former secretary to the First Presidency. A letter to John C. Bennett, August 8, 1842. This can be found in Bennett's book, History of the Saints, pages 247 and 248. Miss Sarah Pratt will come out, and so will Mr. Orson Pratt. Of course, Sarah is Orson's wife. Miss Emmeline White will come out. She was at Mr. Rigdon's yesterday. She said she would tell what she did know, but did not tell what it would be. Okay, George W. Robinson continues, August 8, 1842. Mr. Sidney Rigdon will say something as soon as he is able to write. He has letters from all quarters making inquiries about your accusations against Smith. That's Bennett's accusations against Smith. He, Rigdon, invariably answers them with regard to the case of Nancy Rigdon as it was, but says he knows nothing of the balance, as he has been sick for some time. He's been sick, and did not know what was going on. But so eager were the worthies to get something from him that they have taken an extract from a letter which he wrote to H. Smith some time ago, and they have put it in the WASP as an answer to your call. So some kind of letter from Sidney Rigdon, probably here to Hiram Smith, Joseph Smith's brother, in the WASP newspaper. I believe that's a Mormon newspaper. Okay, Robinson's letter to John C. Bennett. Mr. Rigdon says that drowning men catch at straws, whatever that means. Nancy don't like to be called into the field to say anything about her case herself, but says that I may mention it, I guess that's Robinson, which I shall assuredly do. Okay, let's go to a letter from the Apostle Willard Richards, pictured above, to the prophet Joseph Smith, August 9th, 1842, Joseph Smith Papers. Willard says, my greatest source of enjoyment constantly is that I am permitted to bear some little share in those base slanders. He has some little share in, or he hears about some base slanders about Joseph Smith, falsehoods, calumnies that are so copiously heaped upon the head of God's prophet in these last days, right? Joseph Smith the prophet. So Willard Richards hearing about some of this stuff, probably hearing about Nancy. Okay, another source here from John C. Bennett, Sangamo Journal, August 19th. I, Bennett, proceed to transcribe and forward you an exact copy of Joe Smith's happiness letter to Miss Nancy Rigdon, per Willard Richards, one of the Holy Mormon apostles, alluded to in one of my former communications. Of course, Willard was the scribe of this letter, a scribe to Joseph Smith. All right, a little story here in Joseph Smith's Journal, August 21st, Joseph Smith Papers. This is about Elizabeth Rigdon, who had a vision when she was sick. Elizabeth is the daughter of Sidney Rigdon, one of his daughters. She said that George W. Robinson had it in his heart to deny the faith, but if he did, it would be his damnation. Also, that Nancy Rigdon had near denied the faith, but if she did, she would be damned. Why would she deny the faith? What were the reasons behind that? She also said that John C. Bennett was a wicked man. That's what a lot of Mormons thought, right? Elder Rigdon then stated that he felt himself a new man, that his constitution was renewed. Maybe he got better from being sick. And his system invigorated. He also bore testimony to the truth of the work of the gospel, I guess, work of the kingdom. Maybe Sidney Rigdon here kind of believing that this vision that his daughter Elizabeth is having. So Sidney Rigdon had a lot of kids, 11 children. The oldest of the daughters was Athalia, as we've talked about, then Nancy, then Sarah, then Elizabeth. So Elizabeth was the fourth oldest daughter. 2 sons, Algernon and John Wycliffe, Lacey Ann Rigdon, Samuel Carville, Phoebe, Dorcas, Hortensia, and Ephraim. So large family here. All right, let's go to the Times and Seasons, September 15, 1842, a Mormon newspaper, article called Elder Rigdon, etc. On August 21st, 1842, Elder Sidney Rigdon made his appearance on the stand. He was somewhat emaciated from ill health, but he was not upon the stand to renounce his faith in Mormonism. as had been variously stated by enemies and licentious presses, but appeared to bear his testimony of its truth. Why would there be these rumors in the air, right, of him wanting to renounce his faith? Did that have anything to do with Nancy? Probably. Okay, this article continues. Elder Rigdon, etc. in the Times and Seasons, September 15, 1842. They talk about Elizabeth Rigdon in her deathbed spiritual experience again. Elizabeth said to her elder sister Nancy Rigdon, "It is in your heart to deny the work. And if you do, the Lord says it will be the damnation of your soul." So probably just what the priesthood leaders wanted her to say, right? She said concerning George W. Robinson, as he had denied the faith, the Lord had taken away one of his eye teeth, and unless he repented, he would take away another one of his eye teeth, whatever those are. All right, same article here, Times and Seasons. And concerning Dr. Bennett, John Z. Bennett, that he was a wicked man and that the Lord would tread him under his feet. Not very nice. Elder Rigdon observed that there had been many idle tales and reports abroad concerning him. What were these idle tales? Stating that he had denied the faith. Why would he ever deny the faith? But he would take the opportunity to state that his faith was and had been unshaken in the truth at this time. Okay, Rigdon continues here. It has also been rumored that I believe that Joseph Smith is a fallen prophet. In regard to this, I unequivocally state that I never thought so, but declare that I know he is a prophet of the Lord, even though he approached my daughter Nancy. All right, so what are we to make of all these sayings in public by Sidney Rigdon? The historian Richard S. Van Wagner tells what he thinks in his book, Sidney Rigdon, A Portrait of Religious Success, 1994, probably the definitive book on Sidney. So Van Wagner says, Rigdon had long since ceased worshiping at the shrine of Joseph Smith, though he stated otherwise on numerous occasions, which we've read. Rigdon came to believe most likely after Smith's 1842 attempted seduction of Nancy Rigdon that Joseph was a fallen prophet. So that's Van Wagner's opinion. All right, Van Wagner continues here. After the dust had settled over Joseph Smith's overtures to Nancy Rigdon, Joseph Smith was uncomfortable around the Rigdon family, viewing them with a keen sense of paranoia. All right, Van Wagner continues here. Joseph Smith's imposing presence usually overshadowed disaffection, and the Rigdons, or the Rigdon family's refusal to subordinate their interests to his, angered Joseph Smith. He felt that his prophetic domain was compromised. Okay, another source here in the Joseph Smith papers, History Draft, July 1st to December 31st, 1842. It says, Nauvoo, August 27th, 1842, to His Excellency Emma Smith. And it says, see Sidney Rigdon's letter on account of his daughter Nancy Rigdon. What about Nancy Rigdon? This history was compiled by Willard Richards, the scribe of the Happiness Letter. Rigdon's letter to the WASP denied that Joseph Smith was the author of the Happiness Letter. All right, John C. Bennett tells his story to the Sangamo Journal, August 27, 1842. Pretty long account here. Of course, Bennett was assistant president of the church shortly before this time, basically in the First Presidency. This story is going to be about Nancy Rigdon. He says, Joseph Smith said to me, John C. Bennett, last summer that if you will assist me in procuring Nancy as one of my spiritual wives, I will give you $500. This is what Smith is saying. Or the best lot on Main Street. I, Bennett, replied that I cannot agree to it. Okay, Bennett continues here in the Sangamo Journal. He says that Elder Rigdon is one of my best friends, and his family are now pure and spotless, and it would be a great pity to approach the truly virtuous. Don't approach him. Don't try to take Nancy as a wife, is Bennett's supposed advice to Smith. But, says Joseph Smith, the Lord has given her to me to wife. I have the blessings of Jacob. Jacob was a polygamist, I guess. And there is no wickedness in it. It would be wicked to approach her unless I had permission of the Lord. But as it is as correct as to have a legal wife in a moral point of view. So whatever the Lord says is right, basically, even if it seems wrong, right? It's just as correct as having a legal wife, right? Because polygamy and spiritual wifery, whatever you want to call it, was not legal at this time here in Nauvoo, Illinois. Okay, Bennett continues his story here. It may be so, said Bennett, but you must see her yourself. I cannot approach her on a subject of that kind. Then I suppose the matter had ended, but at the funeral of Mr. Ephraim R. Marks, April 9, 1842, that's how we date this letter, Miss Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde told Miss Nancy Rigdon at this funeral that Joseph desired to see her, Nancy, at the printing office where Mrs. Hyde resides on special business. All right, Bennett continues. Nancy Rigdon said that she would go and accordingly did, but Joseph Smith was busily engaged at the store, or at his store. Dr. Willard Richards, however, one of the Holy 12 Mormon apostles, whom I had long suspected as being up to his eyes in the business with Joe, maybe polygamy. Willard came in and said, Miss Nancy, Joseph cannot be in today. Please call again on Thursday. All right, Bennett continues here. Nancy agreed to do so, but she communicated the matter to Colonel Francis M. Higbee, that was her boyfriend, who was addressing her, and asked his advice as to the second visit. I then came to a knowledge of the facts and went immediately to Joseph Smith and said to him, Joseph, you are a master mason, and Nancy is a master mason's daughter. I guess Sidney Rigdon was a master mason. So stay your hand, or you will get into trouble with the Masons, I guess, against their morality, I guess. Joseph Smith said that you are my enemy, Bennett, and wish to oppose me. No, said I am not your enemy, but you had better stop where you are. And pictured above, Master Mason. All right, Bennett continues. I then went to Colonel Higbee and told him of Joseph Smith's designs, and requested him to go immediately and see Miss Rigdon and tell her the infernal plot, that Joseph Smith would approach her in the name of the Lord by revelation, etc., which is what happened, and to put her on her guard, but advise her to go and see for herself what Joe would do. So kind of give her a warning. All right, so I guess Francis did warn Nancy, and she went down. Joseph Smith was there and took her into a private room and locked the door. There's other accounts about Joseph Smith approaching women to be wives, also when they locked the door. And they commenced by telling her that he had long loved her and had asked the Lord for her, and that it was his holy will that he should have her. He told her that it would not prevent her from marrying any other person. So I guess polyandry was okay. She could have more than one husband. That he had the blessings of Jacob granted to him, and that all was right. He desired to kiss her and wished her to kiss him, but Joe couldn't come it. All right, Bennett continues the story. She, Nancy, said that she would alarm the neighbors if he did not open the door. Unlock this door, you bastard, and let me out. He did so, Joseph Smith did so, and requested Miss Hyde to explain matters to her. Now, Miss Hyde, Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde, was probably married to Joseph Smith at this time. That's why he's choosing her to kind of do some of this dirty work. She's also married, this Miranda Nancy is married to the Apostle Orson Hyde, I think, who is away on a mission. And she's also living with Willard Richards, right? So this all becomes very confusing. Joseph Smith swore her to eternal secrecy, I guess Nancy, and Miss Hyde told her that these things looked strange to her at first, but she would become more reconciled on mature reflection. So maybe Miss Hyde had decided to be one of Joseph Smith's plural wives. Miss Rigdon replied that I never shall. She didn't want to be Joseph Smith's wife, and she turned him down. All right, Bennett continues here. August 27, 1842. As you can see here, we're going along pretty much in a chronological order. Joseph Smith agreed to write her, that's Nancy, and did so in a few days through Dr. Richards. He was the scribe. That letter, the happiness letter, is now safe in the hands of Nancy's friends, who we've talked about. I have seen it, and so has her father. Her father's seen the letter, and various other persons have as well. And why do we call it the happiness letter? Because it begins, happiness is the object and design of our existence, blah, 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 which has been quoted a whole bunch of times in general conference without much context. Okay, so Bennett continues here. He says that at first Joseph Smith tried to deny the whole thing because she turned him down. And then it got into the public, or at least with some of the friends and family of Nancy. So first, Joseph Smith trying to deny everything. On Tuesday last, Joseph Smith came up to Mr. Sidney Rigdon's, accompanied by his high priest, George Miller, of sable notoriety, for a witness. So Joseph Smith and George Miller going to see Sidney. And then by boisterous words and violent gestures tried to deny the attempted seduction. This is what Joseph is doing to Sidney. Boisterous words and violent gestures. I don't know if he laid hands on him or is just doing gestures. And it alarmed the girl, I guess Nancy. It alarmed the girl, but she told him that he was a cursed liar. This is what Nancy is saying. No, Joseph, you did approach me and you're a liar, and that he could not face her, to it. All right, so Bennett continues here. Joseph Smith then made a full acknowledgement of the whole affair. So then he changed his mind and didn't deny it anymore and made a full acknowledgement that, yes, I did approach Nancy. All the family and other persons were present. The holy George Miller observed that you must not harm the Lord's anointed. The Lord will not suffer his anointed to fall. So, according to Bennett, a lot of people are knowing about this. Nancy's family, other people present, George Miller present. All right, Bennett continues. He says, now call upon Miss Rigdon for the truth of the foregoing. So go talk to Nancy about this. If you want to know. Joseph Smith, did you offer another lamb in sacrifice as a burnt sin offering on an altar of 12 stones? So if you're going to commit sin, if you're going to try to get these spiritual wives, you're going to have to sacrifice a lamb, right, as a burnt sin offering, I guess is what he's saying. If not, look out for the destroying angel, for he will surely get you. Okay, a couple days later, Joseph Smith gives a discourse, August 29th, Joseph Smith Papers, and he says, and as to all that Orson Pratt, Sidney Rigdon, or George W. Robinson can do to prevent me, I can kick them off my heels, as many as you can name. I know what will become of them. So what's the context of this, right? Orson Pratt is against polygamy. He doesn't like Joseph Smith approaching his wife, Sarah. Sidney Rigdon and George W. Robinson are not happy that Joseph Smith is approaching Nancy, right? So that's kind of the context here for that discourse. All right, the manuscript history of the church also talks about this. Same date, August 29th, 1842. This is Joseph Smith speaking in a grove near the temple. I, Joseph, had been in Nauvoo all the while and outwitted Bennett's associates. Who were Bennett's associates? George W. Robinson, Nancy Rigdon, Martha Brotherton, Orson Pratt, Sidney Rigdon. All right, so a couple days later, there was something that shows up in the Times and Seasons, September 1st. This is according to Van Wagner in his other book, Mormon Polygamy: A History, 1986. So the Times and Seasons editorialized that the public mind has been unjustly abused through the fallacy of Dr. Bennett's letters. Of course, Times and Seasons is a church newspaper. And the Times and Seasons reminded readers that the church's rule for marriage was that one man should have one wife and one woman, but one husband. That's what Joseph Smith's kind of putting out into the public, right? And then in the private, he's trying to marry all these other women. So yeah, this one man, one wife, one woman, one husband is similar to 1 Corinthians 7, verse 2, right? Since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife and each woman with her own husband. Okay, let's go to an account from Captain John F. Olney, Sangamo Journal, September 14th. I have heard the circumstances of Joseph Smith's attack upon Miss Nancy Rigdon from the family as well as herself, and knowing her to be a young lady who sustains a good moral character and also of undoubted veracity, I must place implicit confidence in her statement. So I'm not sure who this John F. Olney is, actually. All right, Olney continues. I know that Miss Rigdon has been greatly mortified by being obtruded before the public. Nevertheless, it was unavoidable on her part, and if Smith succeeds in extricating himself from the awful dilemma in which he has placed himself by obtaining her certificate to the contrary, then I am much mistaken in the character of Miss Rigdon. All right, John F. Olney continues, September 14th here, 1842. It is true that Mr. Sidney Rigdon has endeavored to allay the excitement upon the subject and has evaded a direct answer to the public as far as he could consistently with the truth, but that part which is true he has left untouched. So Olney saying Sidney Rigdon not telling the whole truth here. All right, Olney continues. The fact of Joseph Smith wishing to marry Miss Rigdon as a spiritual wife, of his attack upon her virtue, his teachings about his having the blessings of Jacob, etc., as stated in General Bennett's letters, are true. These things are true, and if I am called upon to prove it, I shall do it, to the satisfaction of the public and to the chagrin and mortification of Joseph Smith and others. So once Joseph Smith gets busted here, he attacks Nancy's virtue. That was a common tactic for Joseph Smith. All right, Olney continues. The letter published purporting to be from Joseph Smith to Miss Nancy Rigdon, the happiness letter, was not in Joseph Smith's handwriting, but in the handwriting of Dr. Willard Richards, who officiated not only as scribe, but postboy for the prophet, and who did say that he wrote the letter as dictated by Joseph Smith, and said Joseph Smith did say on a certain occasion that he did direct the said Richards to write a letter to Miss Nancy Rigdon, and I now say that I stand ready to prove these allegations by as respectable witnesses as can be produced in Hancock County, and if Joseph Smith has no other means by which he can extricate himself from this than by endeavoring to blast the characters of the innocent and unoffending, like Nancy, to shield himself from infamy and disgrace, then let him fire his tormentum murali, or his gun, and be gathered unto his fathers. All right, John F. Olney continues. Stephen Markham, he talks about, who was a close friend of Joseph Smith and a faithful Mormon. Markham, who has favored the public with his affidavit, which we'll get to, with the apparent design to help Smith out of his dilemma in the extraordinary affair with Miss Rigdon, is a man of little or no reputation, and I could not believe his statement, although made under oath. All right, let's get to this affidavit from Stephen Markham, August 29th, 1842. It's in this source called Affidavits and Certificates, you can see here. Stephen was at the house of Sidney Rigdon in the city of Nauvoo, where he saw Miss Nancy Rigdon laying on a bed. They're going to try to sully Nancy's reputation here. Nancy was laying on a bed, and John C. Bennett was sitting by the side of the bed, near the foot, in close conversation with her. The deponent also saw many vulgar and unbecoming and indecent sayings and motions pass between them, which satisfied the deponent that they were guilty of unlawful and illicit intercourse with each other. So how much of this is true? Markham kind of coming to the defense of Joseph Smith here. I think Joseph Smith later states that this affidavit was not true. I could be wrong, but we'll get to that. All right, we now come to a few statements that are against or oppose Markham's affidavit. This is the certificate of Colonel Carlos Gove, September 3rd, 1842, in History of the Saints. Having been personally acquainted with Miss Nancy Rigdon for some time, I take pleasure in saying to the public that I verily believe Miss Rigdon a lady who sustains a virtuous, chaste, moral, and upright character, and that she has never given reason for anyone whereon to rest a suspicion to the contrary, and that the affidavit of Stephen Markham has procured or was procured for purposes well known to the public, and I also believe that said Markham to be a liar, disturber of the peace, and what may justly be termed a loafer. All right, Sidney Rigdon also says that Stephen Markham is not to be believed. This is a certificate of Sidney Rigdon, September 3rd, 1842, History of the Saints book. Sidney Rigdon is personally acquainted with Stephen Markham of this city, and that the said Markham is not to be believed, that his word for truth and veracity is not good, that he could not believe the said Markham under oath, and that he did on certain occasions testify under oath to that which the deponent knows to be false, and he verily believes that the said Markham knew the same to be false while testifying, and further this deponent saith not. All right, some more information from Andrew F. Smith, a biographer of John C. Bennett, book called The Saintly Scoundrel, The Life and Times of Dr. John Cook Bennett, 1997. Have not been able to get this book because it's so expensive. There's very few copies of it online. Anyway, Andrew Smith says Robinson was present during the incident that Markham had witnessed. According to Robinson, Bennett did come and visit Nancy Rigdon, but she was ill, and Bennett was her attending physician. Okay, historian Andrew F. Smith continues. Robinson employed an attorney to sue Markham, and affidavits were filed on behalf of Nancy Rigdon's character by Oliver Olney, Carlos Grove, and Henry Marks, which we have read. All right, here is the certificate of Colonel Henry Marks. I said that we had read it on the last slide, but now we're going to read it now. September 10th, 1842. So this is Henry Marks. Having been acquainted with Miss Nancy Rigdon for nearly 6 years, I can say that she is a lady of virtuous, chaste, and upright moral character, and I do not believe that she ever gave any occasion for the least suspicion to the contrary. And I do further believe the certificate of Stephen Markham to be false, and given with a malicious design and intent to injure the character of Miss Rigdon unjustly. So the question is, was Joseph Smith behind the Markham affidavit? I would probably say yeah, but I don't have direct proof. All right, George W. Robinson, letter to John C. Bennett, September 16th, regarding this Markham affair. This is in History of the Saints book. Stephen Markham swore that he saw improper conduct between Bennett and Nancy in the post office. The young men in the city came forward and gave a certificate against Markham, stating that they believe that Markham willfully and maliciously lied to injure the character of Miss Nancy Rigdon and to help Joseph Smith out of his dilemma, and that they could not believe Markham under oath. So he's helping Joseph. Did Joseph tell him to do it? I don't know. All right, George W. Robinson continues. You will see that Joseph Smith wants prodigiously to get around the affair with Nancy and will try to do it at the expense of her character. Mr. Rigdon has employed a lawyer. So Sidney Rigdon gets a lawyer here, Calvin A. Warren, Esquire, to prosecute Markham on his affidavit. All right, Robinson continues. Nancy stands firm in the cause of virtue and opposes Joseph Smith to the last. Orson Pratt has been expelled, and Amasa Lyman takes his place. See picture above. He takes his place as one of the apostles in the Quorum of the 12. So for a time, Orson Pratt is out of the Quorum of the 12, probably mostly relating to Joseph Smith's proposal to his wife, Sarah. Okay, another affidavit to the public from Robert Carter, Willard J. Whiting, and Emerson Leland, September 17th, 1842, History of the Saints. They say, without solicitation or the previous knowledge of anyone, we would respectfully state that we have seen letters from 4 individuals residing in and near Nauvoo, addressed to and received by different gentlemen in the states of New York and Massachusetts through the Post Office Department, tending fully and unequivocally to confirm the truth of the disclosures of John C. Bennett in relation to Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, and his followers, especially so far as regards the Seraglio and Order Lodge, and the cases of Miss Sarah M. Pratt, Miss Nancy Rigdon, and Miss Emmeline White. All right, let's go to another source here, John C. Bennett, History of the Saints book, 1842, page 241. Talks about Miss Nancy Rigdon being the eldest unmarried daughter of Sidney Rigdon. She's actually the second eldest. She is a beautiful girl of irreproachable fame, great moral excellence, and superior intellectual endowments. She is a young lady of many charms and varied attractions. Maybe that's why Joseph Smith wanted her, right? But she, too, was marked out for the cloister. What's a cloister? Is a close or enclosed place. I think this is just verbiage that Bennett came up with. That's not really based on reality. He calls it, she was marked out for the cloister, and we'll talk more about that. But yeah, Nancy, a beautiful girl. All right, another source here by William H. Whitsett. He did a biography on Sidney Rigdon. I don't think it was ever published, called The Real Founder of Mormonism, 1885. I don't think it's a very good book or a good, very good biography. And I'm not sure where he got this information or if he just made it up. But he says that Sidney's second daughter, Nancy, was both buxom, in other words, large breasts, and winsome or attractive. She might have passed for the belle of Nauvoo. Okay, some more information about what Nancy may have looked like. This is a Secord letter to Arlene Hess. So that's Jesse Rigdon Secord letter to Arlene Hess, I guess. May 19th, 1967, Hess Collection, Harold B. Lee Library at BYU. Jesse Rigdon Secord wrote that even in her old age, Nancy Rigdon Ellis, Nancy Rigdon, was more than good looking. She was as beautiful as a Greek statue. All right, Bennett continues. Joseph Smith could not suffer a pretty woman to escape without a trial. The inquisitorial Seraglio, which is a palace of the Grand Signior, Turkish Sultan Prince, must swallow up most cases and secure the beautiful birds of gaudy plumage or fascinating charms, right? These beautiful women like Nancy Rigdon, beautiful birds, gaudy plumage, and fascinating charms. It's interesting to see Bennett's language here. And pictured above, I guess we have one of those Turkish sultans or princes. All right, Bennett continues here. He makes up some stuff that's not based on reality here. So not everything Bennett said was true. But this is pretty easy to determine that this is not true. He says, if they fail to be ensnared by the Cyprian saints, Joseph Smith's wives, I guess, ensnared by the Cyprian saints. Cyprian saints is a woman who engages in sexual intercourse in exchange for pay. I don't think Joseph Smith was doing that. But if they fail to be ensnared by the Cyprian saints, they are liable to be taken in the net of the chambered sisters of charity. I think that's just a made-up title. If they pass that fiery ordeal, the poisoned arrows of the consecrates, or of the sacred consecrates of the cloistered await them. But this girl passed the Rubicon with heroic firmness. I guess Nancy. Bennett also claimed that some Mormon women belong to the order of the white, green, and black veils. Again, made-up titles. All right, Bennett continues in his book, History of the Saints, 1842. Knowing that I had much influence with Mr. Rigdon's family, Joe Smith said to me one day last summer when riding together over the lawn in Nauvoo, "If you will assist me in procuring Nancy as one of my spiritual wives, I will give you $500 or the best lot on Main Street." All right, I replied that I cannot agree to it. Elder Rigdon is one of my best friends, and his family are now pure and spotless, and it would be a great pity to approach the truly virtuous. But, said Joe, the Lord has given her to me to wife. All right, Joseph Smith says that I have the blessings of Jacob, meaning a plurality of wives, and there is no wickedness in it. It would be wicked to approach her unless I had permission of the Lord, but as it is as correct as to have a legal wife in a moral point of view. And we've already told this story, but the wording's a little different in History of the Saints, so I go over it again. Jacob's family here, when Joseph says the blessings of Jacob, this chart here shows Jacob's family. Leah was one of his wives, I guess, and then Leah had a servant, Zilpah, and then Rachel, I guess, was one of his wives, and Rachel had a servant called Bilhah, and then it shows some of the children from the wives here, I guess, and I guess also from the servants. All right, Bennett replied that it might be so, but that he must see her himself. Joseph must go to Nancy himself, as Bennett could not approach her on a subject of that kind. There I suppose the matter had ended, but at the funeral of Mr. Ephraim R. Marks, Mrs. Hyde told Miss Rigdon that Joseph desired to see her at the printing office where Miss Hyde and Dr. Richards resided on special business. What was the special business between Mrs. Hyde and Dr. Richards? Living together. She's also married to Orson Hyde. She's also married to Joseph Smith. Richard's an apostle, Joseph a prophet. Okay, Bennett continues. Nancy said that she would go, and accordingly did, but Joe was busily engaged at the store. Dr. Willard Richards, however, one of the Holy 12 Mormon apostles and spiritual high priest and pander general for lust. Willard Richards was a pander general for lust, basically a pimp, whom I had long suspected as being up to his eyes in the business with Joe, I guess polygamy. He came in and said, "Miss Nancy, Joseph cannot be in today. Please call again on Thursday." And here's maybe what a pimp looked like in 1842, according to AI. All right, Bennett continues. This Nancy agreed to do, but she communicated the matter to Colonel Francis M. Higbee, her boyfriend, who was addressing her, and asked his advice as to the second visit. I then came to a knowledge of the facts and went immediately to Joe and said to him, "Joseph, you are a master mason, and Nancy is a master mason's daughter." And he says, "So is Miss Sarah Pratt, the daughter of Mr. Bates." So I guess Mr. Bates was also a master mason. So he's telling Joseph Smith to stay his hand, or you will get into trouble with the Masons. Remember your obligation to the Masons. Joseph Smith was a Mason. He got some of the secret handshakes for his temple ceremony from the Masons. You can read this meme up here above if you want. All right, Bennett continues. Joseph Smith replied, "You are my enemy, Bennett, and wish to oppose me." I then went to Colonel Higbee and told him Joseph Smith's designs and requested him to go immediately and see Miss Rigdon and tell her the infernal plot, to warn her. that Joseph Smith would approach her in the name of the Lord by special revelation, etc. Yep, which is what happened. And to put her on her guard, but advise her to go and see for herself what Joe would do. What Joe would do. He did so, and she went down. Nancy went down. All right, Bennett continues here. Joseph Smith was there, took her into a private room, his favorite assignation room, Bennett says, which is a place to meet lovers. He locked the door, undoubtedly thinking somewhat in the strain of the poet, "O Nancy, my love, we ne'er were sages, but trust me, all that Tully's zeal expressed for Plato's glowing pages, all that and more for thee I feel, whate'er the heartless would decree, howe'er unfeeling prudes condemn, Nancy, I would rather sin with thee than live and die a saint with them." So Bennett doing some poetry here. Not sure what Tully's zeal expressed for Plato's glowing pages are. Bennett makes up some pretty interesting sentences. All right, Bennett continues here. Joseph Smith then swore Nancy to secrecy and told her that she had long been the idol of his affections and that he had asked the Lord for her and that it was his holy will that he should have her as one of the chambered sisters of charity. But that if she had any scruples on the subject, basically in becoming a concubine, he would consecrate her with the cloistered saints and marry her immediately. So it was up to Nancy, right? She could either become a concubine or she could marry Joseph. That it would not prevent her from marrying any other person, so she could actually practice polyandry, which we've talked about, if she wanted, or just be a concubine. That he had the blessings of Jacob granted to him, and that all was lawful and right before God. And these the blessings and the lawful and right part here are language that show up in the happiness letter. Okay, Bennett continues the story. Joseph Smith, then attempted to kiss her and desired her to kiss him. She told him that she would alarm the neighbors if he did not open the door and let her out immediately. He did so, and as she was much agitated, he requested Mrs. Hyde to explain matters to her, and after agreeing to write her a doctrinal letter, the happiness letter, left the house. Mrs. Hyde told her that these things looked strange to her at first, but that she would become more reconciled on mature reflection. And of course, Mrs. Hyde probably married to Joseph Smith as well, and she's kind of the go-between. All right, Bennett continues. Miss Rigdon replied that I never shall become a concubine. I never shall become a wife. I'm not going to do polyandry. I'm not going to do any of it. Nancy left the house and returned home. In a day or two, Dr. Richards, who is so notorious for hiding in these last days, which means basically Richards was living with Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde, as we talked about. They're hiding together. Richards handed her the following letter from the prophet Joe, the happiness letter, written by Richards by Joseph Smith's dictation, and requested her to burn it after reading, which I think happened in other cases as well. Nancy did not burn it. The letter starts circulating amongst her family and friends, and now ends up in the Joseph Smith Papers Project. And then Bennett mentions some of the people who saw the letter. The original happiness letter, of which the above is a literal copy, is in the handwriting of Dr. Richards. It is now in my possession. It was handed to me by Colonel Francis M. Higbee in the presence of General George W. Robinson. And we have statements from all these people. Okay, Bennett continues. On Tuesday, the 28th day of June last, Joseph Smith went to Mr. Sidney Rigdon's house, accompanied by his high priest, George Miller. So Miller and Joseph Smith are going over to Rigdon's house. Miller is of sable sister notoriety. maybe calling George Miller a weasel or dark. But Miller was a witness for him that he had successfully confronted Miss Rigdon, and by boisterous words and violent gestures, Joseph Smith tried to deny the attempted seduction and alarm the girl. But with daring bravery, Nancy met the monster of iniquity, Joseph, and told him that he was a cursed liar, that all that she had said of him was true to the letter, and dared him to face her to the contrary. All right, Joseph Smith then made a full acknowledgement of the whole affair. So he denies it, then acknowledges it. This was in the presence of the family, I guess Rigdon's family, and several other persons who were present. The demoniacal high priest, George Miller, then groaned in the spirit. Demoniacal high priest, George Miller. He groaned in the spirit and cried aloud, "You must not harm the Lord's anointed. The Lord will not suffer his anointed to fall." Okay, if Joseph Smith did not offer another lamb in sacrifice as a burnt sin offering, like in the Old Testament, I guess, on an altar of 12 stones, I fear the destroying angel will get him, for even the fiends of his father's kingdom have demurred to the spiritual doctrines of his seraglio. All right, statement here from Joseph Smith's brother, William Smith, pictured above in the Wasp newspaper, August 27, 1842, doing some apologetics, some of which I think apologists still use. So William says, the sixth letter is what purports to be a copy of a letter from Joseph Smith to Miss Nancy Rigdon. It is without date, name, or proof. Yeah, because Joseph didn't really want the letter getting out with a date on it and his name on it. And if it had these, is upon the whole more moral than Bennett ever was or will be of himself. What, the letter is more moral? I'm not sure. But we hope the community are not yet quite so far from a common course of justice and propriety as to take Bennett's word for the truth or fallacy of the curious thing. Joseph Smith is not the author. Yeah, apologists still using that, right? Maybe the letter was written by Bennett. We don't know if Joseph Smith really is the author. Okay, the certificate of Sidney Rigdon in the Wasp newspaper, August 31st. He's first counselor in the First Presidency at the time. This is Nauvoo, August 27th, 1842. Sidney writes into the editor of the Wasp, "Dear Sir, I am fully authorized by my daughter Nancy Rigdon to say to the public, through the medium of your paper, that the letter or the happiness letter, which has appeared in the Sangamo Journal, making part of General Bennett's letters to the said paper, purporting to have been written by Mr. Joseph Smith to her, Nancy, this letter was unauthorized by her, Nancy, and that she never said to General Bennett or any other person that the said letter was written by the said Mr. Smith, nor in his handwriting, but by another person and in another person's handwriting." Yeah, so Sidney seems to be kind of doing some apologetics here. Not sure why. Maybe Joseph Smith wants him to. Maybe he wants to keep on the good side of Joseph right now. But we already have the answers to these questions. Yes, the letter was not in Joseph Smith's handwriting. It was in Willard Richards' handwriting, and he was the scribe. That solves that issue. Okay, Sidney Rigdon continues to the editor of the Wasp. Nancy further wishes me to say that she never at any time authorized General Bennett to use her name in the public papers, as he has done, which has been greatly to the wounding of her feelings, and she considers that the obtruding of her name before the public in the manner in which it has been done, to say the best of it, it is a flagrant violation of the rules of gallantry, and cannot avoid to insult her feelings, which she wishes the public to know. I would further state that Mr. Smith denied to me the authorship of that letter. All right, but notice how Sidney doesn't deny that a letter exists. There's some kind of a letter. So yeah, Sidney does not deny the existence of the letter, just the authorship, I guess. All right, let's move on to another source here. Discussion by General Bennett about Joe Smith and the Mormons, the New York Herald, August 31st, 1842. Apparently, this is John C. Bennett reading a letter from General Robinson to General James Arlington Bennett. It says that Orson Pratt said to Joseph Smith, "Sir, you are a liar, and if the angel of the Lord was to tell me that you wasn't, I wouldn't believe him. So is the case of Miss Nancy Rigdon. When Joe was cornered about trying to seduce her, he said that he only did it to see if so-and-so could be done." Great applause and laughter. Okay, same source here, the New York Herald. Why Joseph Smith offered me $500 or the same in town lots. So this is Bennett speaking. If I would get him Nancy Rigdon for a secret wife. And when he was confronted with her, he denied the whole. But when his love letter, the happiness letter to her, was shown him, he confessed all. But he said that he only wished to ascertain the truth, if she was virtuous or not, and he took that way to prove it. Roars of laughter even from the ladies. So it was a test, right? Now Joseph Smith saying, I was just testing her to see if she would remain virtuous. We have another source basically saying the same thing about Joseph here in a statement of Maria Champlin, Nauvoo High Council Minutes, May 24th, 1842, Church History Library, from a Lyman O. Littlefield, who said that Joseph tried to persuade men to act wickedly and then exposed them, kind of in like an Abrahamic test. Okay, going back to the WASP, church-owned newspaper, I believe, September 3rd, 1842. We are authorized to say by General Joseph Smith that the affidavit of Stephen Markham relative to Miss Nancy Rigdon as published in the Handbill of Affidavits was unauthorized by him, Joseph. So now Joseph is saying that that affidavit by Markham was unauthorized by him, which I think I had mentioned earlier. The certificate of Elder Rigdon relative to the letter being satisfactory. Joseph's basically saying, let's just go with the apologetics of Rigdon's certificate. Okay, let's go to another source, Essex County Washingtonian, Salem, Massachusetts newspaper, September 15th, 1842, cited in the Times and Seasons. Bennett, then read a letter, which was the happiness letter, which, taking the entire impression made on us, we incline to hold authentic, written by Joe Smith to Miss Nancy Rigdon in explanation, as he called it, of proposals that he had previously made her, Nancy. 'Twas not without a certain devilish talent, skillfully employing holy words, and striving to make black appear white, and effect it might possibly have wrought, had the person addressed believed with undoubting assurance the writer to be a holy man. So yeah, pretty good writing, right? In order to accomplish manipulation. Joseph Smith has this devilish talent, skillfully employing holy words to get Nancy to do what he wants. I basically agree with that. Okay, some more information from Richard Van Wagner in his book Mormon Polygamy, A History, 1986. Talks about the Times and Seasons editor, Joseph Smith. On October 1st, 1842, Joseph Smith explained, "We have given the above rule of marriage, which is monogamy. The rule for the public was that the church teaches monogamy, but in secret, Joseph Smith practicing polygamy. Monogamy is the only one practiced in this church. We show that Dr. John C. Bennett's secret wife system is a matter of his own manufacture." Right, it's only Bennett that's doing this secret wife system kind of stuff. I'm not doing it. All right, let's go to another source here. Oliver H. Olney, The Absurdities of Mormonism Portrayed in 1843. So very early on, still, before Joseph Smith is dead. Miss Nancy Rigdon had repeated calls to visit a Mrs. Hyde, until she made a visit. Soon after her arrival at Mrs. Hyde's, Joseph Smith visited her. He told her that he had the word of God for her, that God had given her to him for a wife. Miss Rigdon said to him, "You have a wife." Emma Smith, right? All right, Oliver continues. Well, said Joseph Smith, you know the ancient order was that one man had many wives in the Old Testament, right? And that is again to be. Miss Rigdon was obstinate. He then got Mrs. Hyde to come in and made use of her persuasive arguments that she was first unbelieving in the order, but had been better informed, although she had long been acquainted with Miss Rigdon, but her many arguments were of no account. Nancy didn't believe Mrs. Hyde. All right, Oliver continues. There's another book called The Writings of Oliver H. Olney that has some of his other writings as well. Joseph Smith again used his influence by more rash means, that Miss Rigdon threatened to call for help, that he let her go, but soon a letter was conveyed to her, the happiness letter, written by someone of the clan, he doesn't say it's Joseph here, that argued the doctrine of polygamy about as well as Jacob's pamphlet. I should think as I read it, and it contained about the same, except a few dry compliments to her. So, Oliver says he read the letter. Okay, Oliver Olney continues. Miss Rigdon has been a member of the church with her parents since she was 8 or 10 years old, in good standing. I have been personally acquainted with her since she was a small child, and know that Miss Rigdon has sustained a good character at home and abroad. All right, Oliver Olney said something very similar in the Christian Register and Boston Observer, October 29th, 1842. He says, I have been personally acquainted with Miss Nancy Rigdon from her infancy to the present time, and a more virtuous lady, I believe, never lived. I do not believe that any act in her life could give the least suspicion to the most designing and eager of mischief makers. All right, Oliver Olney continues, but what do we hear of Nancy now, but as being of the blackest dye? Yes, she is defamed by all, both high and low, of the Latter-day Saints. So, Markham, Joseph Smith, the sound was gone, her to oppress. Yes, Miss Rigdon now has to bear the slaying, because she did not conform to Joseph Smith's word of God, but barely a youth, she for herself spoke, and showed that she was not to be duped. Okay, a history draft here, February 11th, 1843, Joseph Smith Papers. Joseph Smith had an interview with Elder Sidney Rigdon and his family. They expressed a willingness to be saved. Good feelings prevailed, and we again shook hands together. So, kind of getting along here. All right, but then a little while later, about a month and a half, Joseph Smith writes a letter to Sidney Rigdon, March 27th, 1843. That's also in the Joseph Smith Papers. I, Joseph Smith, have tried for a long time to smother my feelings and not let you, Sidney Rigdon, know that I thought that you were secretly and underhandedly doing all that you could to take the advantage and injure me, but whether my feelings are right or wrong remains for eternity to reveal. Joseph Smith wants to know whether he can trust Sidney. All right, some of Joseph Smith's paranoia coming out here in the same letter to Sidney Rigdon, March 27th, 1843. So we're moving on to 1843 now. This is Joseph Smith Papers. I, Joseph, am, sir, honest when I say that I believe that I am laboring under the fullest conviction that you are actually practicing deception and wickedness against me. That's Sidney Rigdon. You're practicing deception and wickedness against me. And the church, and that you are in connection with John C. Bennett and George W. Robinson in the whole of their abominable practices, in seeking to destroy me and the people. So he's not sure if he can trust Sidney. Sidney kind of goes back and forth. All right, moving on to another source here. Francis M. Higbee does some poetry. Remember, he's Nancy's boyfriend. This is in an article called The Buckeyes' First Epistle to Joe, Warsaw Signal, April 25th, 1844. Francis says, "Have you, Joseph, forgot the snare that you laid for Nancy, who was the lovely Buckeye maid? Have you forgot your snare? With all your priestly arts arrayed, her to seduce, assisted by that wretched bawd who kept the house." He's probably talking about Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde here, that wretched bawd. If you look up bawd in the 1828 dictionary, it says to procure or to provide women for lewd purposes. All right, Francis continues, "But she, Nancy, in virtue's armor steeled, was proof against what you revealed, and to your doctrines would not yield the least belief, although the scriptures you did wield in your relief." Like, polygamy in the Old Testament, I guess. All right, Francis continues, "And when you saw that she would detest such doctrines in her noble breast," turn him down, "and did despise the man, though a priest, who taught them too, a sallow, yellow, lustful beast, poor Joe, like you." All right, Francis M. Higbee, the boyfriend of Nancy, continues, "'Twas then you changed your lover's size, and vengeful hate flashed in your eyes, when you found out that she did despise you as a man." She did despise Joseph as a man. "So took to circulating lies your usual plan," right? That was something Joseph did several times, right? Circulating lies about Nancy and other women that had turned him down. According to Francis, Joseph Smith's usual plan. All right, "just that you might destroy her fame and give to her a ruined name, so that if she should ever proclaim what you had tried, your friends might turn on her the shame and say that she lied." All right, "but Joe, in this you fairly tailed. Though you her father's house assailed, she met you face to face, and you quailed or languished before her frown, and like a counterfeit she nailed you tightly down." All right, "although you tried by priestly power to make this gentle creature cower, and eat her words that you might tower in priestly pride, but strong in truth she in that hour told you that you lied." All right, Francis continues, Warsaw Signal, April 25th, 1844. Joseph Smith would die pretty soon after this. "And when you found that it would not do, then like a coward poltroon, you acknowledged what she had said was true unto her sire or father." Joseph Smith acknowledged what Nancy had said was true unto her father, "but then you'd nothing more in view than just to try her," right? The test, which we had talked about. "Oh, I didn't really mean to marry her or have her as a concubine. I was just giving her a test." All right, Francis continues. He puts down seducers like Joseph and like John C. Bennett here. He calls John C. Bennett Joab, I guess a code name. So Francis says, "And put her on her guard," that's Nancy, "that she might keep herself all pure and free from base seducers like to me," Joseph, "and Joab, vile." So seducers like Joseph and John C. Bennett, "for that it was revealed to thee we would beguile." Okay, O Joe, thy slanderous tongue Some burning tears from me have wrung, and I had thought to have held my tongue and nothing said, if thou hadst but repentance shown and shut thy head. Joseph did not show repentance. Okay, Francis continues. But thy repeated slanders vile, against Nancy, I guess, shall not be long borne by this child, Nancy, I guess, although by nature he is mild and well disposed, thy sins from continent to isle shall be exposed. All right, and then Francis talks about some of the violence committed by Mormons in Missouri. Missouri's deeds shall come to light, though perpetrated in the night by hirelings who thought it right to do thy will, Joseph's will, by cabin conflagration bright to scalp and kill. Cabin conflagration or burning down cabins. All right, repent, repent, there still is time, and add no more dark crime to crime, but think how mighty and sublime thy calling first, and in black sackcloth bow thee down low in the dust. And of course we know that Mormon church leaders don't usually do this. And put away far from thy heart each wicked, sensual, sinful art, and from the truth no more depart, long as you live, but stop and make another start, and I'll forgive. Okay, Francis continues. If not, your dark deeds in Nauvoo, as well as in Missouri too, like Hamlet's ghost, shall rise to view with old White Hat. Then tremble, tyrant, for but few will sanction that. So like Hamlet's ghost shall rise to view with old White Hat. Bennett claimed that Joseph Smith signed a letter to a woman to whom he was attracted to. He signed it as Old White Hat. So that's a reference to Joseph. You can see that in Bennett's book. All right, Francis goes on in his epistle, his first epistle to Joe. But I must stop this long epistle. My pen is worn down to the gristle, and 'tis the poet's only missile. In truth's relief, for be it known to all, this child ain't yet a chief. All right, Francis here now calling Joseph Smith a tyrant. Though he his lineage can trace back to the Bruce and Wallace days, when they for liberty did raise the sword and broke, as I intend in these last days, a tyrant's yoke. Trace his lineage back to the Bruce, that's Robert the Bruce, and back to Wallace, that's William Wallace, who I think they made a movie at, right? A movie about Braveheart. All right, let's move on to another source. Joseph H. Jackson did a whole video on him. A narrative of the adventures and experiences of Joseph H. Jackson in Nauvoo, 1844. Kind of became like an insider to Joseph Smith for a while. Very interesting book if you want to read this whole thing. It's not very long. And 1844, around the time Joseph died. So Joseph Jackson says, when, as happens in the cases of Miss Martha Brotherton and Miss Nancy Rigdon, the prophet's overtures were rejected with disdain and exposure, Joseph threatened that he would set 100 hellhounds on them to destroy their reputations. So set some hellhounds out on Nancy. All right, Francis M. Higbee to the editor of the Warsaw Signal, May 29, 1844. He, Joseph Smith, as well as I, Francis, recollects well the cause which first induced me to question Joseph's pretensions to sincerity, and which gave rise, as he says, to my grief, quote unquote, which was the base attack that he, Joseph Smith, made upon the virtue of Miss Nancy Rigdon in 1842, to whom I was at that time paying my addresses. In other words, he was her boyfriend. All right, Francis Higbee continues here in the Warsaw Signal, May 29th, 1844. The attack that Joseph Smith made was of so base, so loathsome, and so detestable a character that I, Francis, could not conceal my feelings from the base seducer, and I assailed Joseph Smith about the matter in, as I think, quite likely rather a rough manner, for I felt much excited indeed when he, Smith, assured me that I must keep perfectly dark and be quiet. So apparently Joseph Smith tells Francis to stay quiet, don't say anything, or he would serve a quietus upon me. If you look that up, in 1828, Webster's Dictionary, quietus is death. Francis is basically saying Joseph Smith threatened him with death if he didn't remain quiet. All right, Francis continues here, but I could not feel reconciled towards Joseph, and I made another assault upon him. And he, upon that occasion, told me that he would blow my character to the four winds. Yep, Joseph had done that before to other people. If I did not be still, for God would deal with him. If I would be still and mind my own business, and that I was only exciting and agitating the attack that he made upon Nancy for the sake of ensuring to myself an imperishable name, or some words to that effect. All right, Francis continues, the boyfriend of Nancy. The excitement upon my part was still on the increase, Francis said, for as I reflected upon the matter, the more and more I became astonished to think that Joseph Smith, a man professing to be a Messiah, sent by the God of heaven to revolutionize and Christianize this depraved and fallen generation, right, overcome the apostasy, would have the presumption to attack the virtue of any female with whom I was corresponding, and that too under the cloak of Christianity, was more than I could or ever will bear from him or any other man made in the image of his God. All right, Francis continues, not a fan of Joseph Smith here. I care not what his pretensions of Christianity may be, or how many revelations he may call to his aid. He is a dark fiend from the Tartarian regions, and hell stands wide to swallow him up. And I would here recommend that Joseph Smith should look well to the west, for the figure of the Lord hath written it upon the wall. Mein Tekel Upsharon. Mein Tekel Upharson. Not sure how to say that. I think that's referring to Daniel 5:25 through 28, which is, thou are weighed in the balance and are found wanting. That is Joseph Smith. All right, Francis continues, Joseph Smith discovered my feelings and commenced raging against me by assailing my character in every corner of the street and in any private circle, and he soon commenced his outrageous attacks upon my character from the public stand. All right, finally, Sidney Rigdon, in October 15, 1844, after Joseph Smith is dead, and I think Sidney is setting up his own congregation again, finally comes out strongly against Joseph Smith. This is in the Messenger and Advocate, Pittsburgh, not the one that's in the church, but this is the Pittsburgh one that Sidney also named Messenger and Advocate. So Sidney says, it is a fact so well known that the 12 and their adherents have endeavored to carry on the spiritual wife business, the 12 and their adherents, and have gone to the most shameful and desperate lengths to keep it from the public, first insulting innocent females, and when they resented the insult, these monsters in human shape would assail their characters by lying and perjuries with a multitude of desperate men to help them effect the ruin of those whom they had insulted, and all this to enable them to keep these corrupt practices from the view of the world. So he doesn't directly mention Joseph Smith. He says the 12 and their adherents have endeavored to carry on the spiritual wife business, but he definitely coming out against the church here. All right, so Sidney Rigdon does eventually come out against Joseph Smith and his polygamy. January 1st, 1845. Messenger and Advocate again, Pittsburgh edition. So in 1845, Sidney Rigdon said that Joseph had contracted a whoring spirit. Joseph Smith had contracted a whoring spirit, and there we see the whore on these red dragons. I think those are mentioned in Revelation. All right, so here we are, April 27, 1845. I think during this time frame, Sidney Rigdon was vying for power in the church, maybe after Joseph Smith died, maybe trying to take over the church. Pretty quickly he does go and establish his own church, I think his own congregation. But this is a speech of Elder and Apostle Orson Hyde, High Priest Quorum in Nauvoo, April 27, 1845. And he's going to basically put down Nancy, as she's already been put down by Joseph Smith and others, Markham. During my absence to Palestine, he had left his wife, Miranda Nancy Johnson, right? Who's kind of shacking up with Willard Richards. So Elder Apostle Orson Hyde's over there in Palestine. He says, and the conduct of Sidney's daughter, Nancy, became notorious in the city. According to common rumor, she was regarded generally little, if any, better than a public prostitute. Pretty brutal. All right, Orson Hyde continues here. He says, Joseph Smith, knowing the conduct that she was guilty of, that's Nancy, felt anxious to reprove and reclaim her if possible. We're just trying to keep Nancy virtuous, right? He accordingly requested my wife, Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde, to invite her down to her house. He wished to speak with her and show her the impropriety of being gallanted about by so many different men, right? Basically a prostitute, many of whom were comparatively strangers to her. But my opinion, maybe she's having sex with Francis, and that's about it. All right, so the Apostle Orson Hyde gives his version of events here, a few years later after it happened. Nancy's own parents could look upon it and think that all was right, being blind to the faults of their daughter. And there's like no evidence of this, of what he's saying in the past that we've gone through in this video. There being so many of this kind of men visiting Mr. Rigdon's house at the steamboat landing, for he kept sort of a tavern or a boarding house, that Mr. Smith did not care to go there to see her. All right, Orson Hyde continues. High Priest Quorum in Nauvoo. Miss Nancy, I presume, considered her dignity highly insulted at the plain and sharp reproofs that she received from this servant of God. She ran home and told her father that Mr. Smith wanted her for a spiritual wife, and that he employed my wife, Miranda Nancy Johnson, to assist him in obtaining her. All right, Orson continues. He's going to discredit Bennett as well. This was a good time for Miss Nancy and John C. Bennett to wreak vengeance on the victim of their hatred for his severe admonitions, right? Joseph Smith. Mr. Bennett, I think, was a boarder at Mr. Rigdon's at that time. I'm not sure if that's true. And I am told was all honey with the whole family. Bennett and Rigdon's family very close, according to Orson. Oh, there's nobody like Dr. John C. Bennett. All right, and Orson Hyde comes up kind of with his own story here. He says, Mr. Rigdon also thought that this was a good time to crush a member of the Johnson family, against which he had an old grudge, because Father Johnson, after giving him and his family a living for a long time, building a stone house for them to live in, etc., would not give him his farm, and all of his property, for he once demanded of Father Johnson a deed of all his property without offering $1 as an equivalent. I'm not really buying this. All right, Orson Hyde. Miss Nancy is made, therefore, to attribute to Joseph Smith and to my wife, Miranda Nancy, a language which neither of them ever used. Thus must an innocent and unsuspecting female suffer for putting down a hand to help, Miranda Nancy, I guess, as it is verily believed a poor, miserable girl out of the very slough of prostitution. So Miranda Nancy's just there trying to help poor Nancy Rigdon, this poor, miserable girl, trying to help her out of prostitution. All right, Orson here is now saying that Sidney Rigdon is now making accusations that Joseph Smith did try to seduce Nancy. Orson continues, here is now a curious case before us. Mr. Rigdon testified here on Sunday, the 4th of August last, before some thousands of witnesses, that the same man, Joseph Smith, who he says tried to seduce his daughter, so there it is a true martyr, has ascended to heaven, and holds the keys of the kingdom. So maybe now Sidney going public about this seduction of Nancy. All right, Apostle Orson Hyde continues. Sounds like Sidney Rigdon's kind of vying for power here. He's trying to take over the church, but has to establish his own congregation. Mr. Rigdon said also that God had revealed to him in Pittsburgh that the kingdom must be built up to that same man, Joseph Smith, who he now says tried to seduce his daughter. So maybe Sidney's coming out in public on this now. If one portion of Mr. Rigdon's testimony is true, and I fail to endorse it as truth, that Joseph holds the keys of the kingdom, I think he and Miss Nancy both will have a rather hard work to get by him into the kingdom, inasmuch as they tell these hard stories about him. Joseph Smith, they're kind of standing at the pearly gates of heaven, right? It's kind of a sentinel. Maybe you have to get by Joseph Smith. Maybe you have to give him some of the secret handshakes or whatever. I don't know. All right, so the prophet Brigham Young said something similar in 1859. You can find this in Journal of Discourses, Volume 7. No man or woman in this dispensation will ever enter into the celestial kingdom of God without the consent of Joseph Smith. Every man and woman must have the certificate of Joseph Smith, Jr. as a passport to their entrance into the mansion where God and Christ are. Joseph Smith reigns there as a supreme being in his sphere, capacity, and calling as God does in heaven. Basically saying he's as supreme as God. Many will exclaim, oh, that is very disagreeable, but it is true. Okay, back to Orson Hyde. Shame on such miserable trash. I am sick, Mr. President, of dwelling upon such wicked inconsistencies. But as I have been appointed to deliver this address, I am resolved to endure to the end. Can you? And cries of yes and yes. We will all endure to the end. All right, Orson continues. Can Mr. Sidney Rigdon believe that Joseph Smith ever tried to seduce his daughter? Can he believe that he ever tried to get her for a spiritual wife? If he really believes this of Mr. Smith, how could he propose to build up the kingdom to him unless he fellowships such abominable works? All right, Orson Hyde getting riled up here. But if Mr. Joseph Smith had tried to get Miss Nancy for a carnal wife, he might probably have been successful. So I guess he didn't even try. I do not, however, think Mr. Rigdon believes any such thing of Joseph Smith, but because he was rejected as the leader of this people, he now seeks to destroy us by the most cruel slanders, the most wicked misrepresentations, and the foulest calumnies that ever proceeded from disappointed ambition. All right, a small little tangent here. Who were the people trying to succeed Joseph Smith? This is a little graphic by John Hamer. So it was Sidney Rigdon, William Smith, William Marks, Lyman White, Brigham Young, Alpheus Cutler, David Whitmer, James Strang, and Joseph Smith III. And Brigham Young wins that battle. All right, preach it, Mr. Hyde. Those who were the most active in exposing Rigdon's wicked designs and in bringing them to light before this people are the ones at whom his most poisonous arrows are directed. But envy and wrath will leave their own sting in the heart where they dwell. All right, so let's go back to BYU professor Jared Dirkmaat in his article in the Journal of Mormon History here. In this article, he's basically trying to create doubt as to who wrote the happiness letter. It's basically apologetics. Journal of Mormon History, July 2016. But one thing I like in the article is he does a pretty good job discrediting Orson Hyde's tirade. So Jared or Garrett says Orson Hyde's statement, see the previous slides, has often been discounted as a desperate and pejorative attack upon Nancy Rigdon's character for the purpose of discrediting her and her father, Sidney, and concealing polygamy. All right, Garrett, or Jarrett, sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right, continues. Indeed, as an apostle, second only to Brigham Young in seniority in the quorum, I think they were pretty close, and one who was himself secretly practicing polygamy, that's Orson, he had every reason to fabricate and embellish this explanation of the Nancy Rigdon episode to both defend Joseph Smith and solidify his own hold on power. So yeah, Orson was a polygamist. He would marry 8 wives and father 32 children. You can see Wikipedia article on Orson Hyde. All right, Dirkmaat. It has also been observed that Orson Hyde was not even in the country at the time of the first meeting between Joseph Smith and Nancy Rigdon, or any of the subsequent fallout, and thus his story has been afforded little credibility. He was gone. Hyde was serving a mission in Jerusalem from April 15th, 1840 to December 7th, 1842. So, yeah, right during the time frame that this all happened. All right, Dirkmaat continues. Hyde's statements should be critically analyzed and used with extreme hesitancy by historians. So yeah, Hyde is not that important. Dirkmaat can kind of throw him under the bus. What's more important is protecting Joseph Smith and creating doubt that he wrote this happiness letter, which is so manipulative and coercion, manipulative, undue influence, coercion against Nancy. All right, let's go to another source. Public discussion of the issues between E.L. Kelly and Clark Braden, 1884. So we're jumping way into the future here. 1884, a late account. He's going to talk about Joseph Smith approaching Nancy way back in Kirtland, Ohio, when she was only 16. So Clark Braden says, common report said that a bitter quarrel between Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith shortly before they left Kirtland, Ohio, was because Joseph Smith wanted to have Nancy Rigdon, a girl of 16, sealed to him. So back in Ohio, she's only 16, not 19. All right, same source. Question. Is it your recollection or your impression, Mr. Smith, and this is William C. Smith, that you have heard of the sealing of women to men here in Kirtland and the sealing of Nancy Rigdon to Joseph Smith? Answer, my impression is I have. He had heard of the sealing of Nancy to Joseph Smith. This is William C. Smith, so this is not Joseph Smith's brother. All right, William continues here in the same source, public discussion. I have heard it talked about of here in Kirtland, Ohio, and that the story obtained that the difficulty between Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon was in consequence of the wish or the manifestation on the part of Joseph Smith that Rigdon's daughter Nancy should be sealed to him. All right, same source here, 1884. Question. Do you not know, Mr. Smith, that there was not any report of any such thing as that as of Nancy Rigdon being sealed to Joseph Smith while the saints were here in Kirtland? And William Smith answers, my impression is that that report was here in Kirtland. I went to school with Athalia Rigdon, that's Nancy's older sister, and there was talk among the boys about sealing. I think there was difficulty between Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon with reference to having Rigdon's daughter sealed to Smith. I would not positively say it was so, but that is my impression. All right, let's go to a different source regarding this issue. This is William H. Kelly and E.L. Kelly, again, interview with Nancy Rigdon in 1884. So they're actually interviewing Nancy about this now. This can be found in the History of the Reorganized Church, Volume 4. On being questioned with reference to her, Nancy's knowledge of sealing and polygamy, Nancy said she never heard tell of such a thing as sealing or polygamy in Kirtland, Ohio. We called her attention to the fact that one William Smith, a Campbellite exhorter, stated to us in Kirtland that he thought that she was sealed to Joseph Smith in Kirtland. All right, Nancy continues here in the same source. Nancy says, this is absolutely false. I never heard of such a thing while in Kirtland as a sealing. We asked, were you ever at any time or place sealed to Joseph Smith? And Nancy says, I was never at any time, because she basically rejected him, right? All right, some more information here about this issue from Joseph Smith's neighbor, Lorenzo Saunders. He was interviewed by E.L. Kelly, November 12, 1884, RLDS Church Library Archives. He says, well, I, Lorenzo, will tell you if Joseph Smith had polygamous wives, as it is represented, as I saw in that book that Hurlbut had, and that he wanted Sidney Rigdon's oldest daughter, Athalia, down there in Kirtland, sealed to him. I read it in his book. Hurlbut's book, right? Mormonism Unveiled. I looked in there for Nancy or for Athalia, and I don't see anything in there about it. All right, another late account, 1886, Wilhelm Wymetal book, Joseph Smith the Prophet, His Family, and Friends. The facts themselves about this happiness letter will not be doubted by the reader. After all, he has heard of the Nauvoo Don Juan, Joseph Smith. They are besides warranted to be true by the testimony of Miss Sarah Pratt, we've talked about her, who knew Nancy intimately and says that she was a very good, virtuous girl and that Bennett's tale is true in all of its essential points. Okay, Wilhelm Wymetal continues. I don't want anybody's testimony that this letter is genuine. I feel it in every line, comparing it with Hiram's Jesuitical letter about the mysteries of the kingdom, not sure what that is, comparing it to the revelation on celestial marriage, maybe D&C 132, and the affidavits of William Clayton and other products of this holy oil refinery. Yeah. And we've compared it to a lot of things, this happiness letter, to a lot of other things in this video, and showing that Wilhelm is right here. You can see all the similarities in the letter and other sources, which we've gone over quite a bit. He fills it in every line. It's similar to other revelations by Joseph Smith, etc. All right, Wilhelm Wymetal continues. Joseph Smith the Prophet, His Family and Friends, 1886. Footnote on page 290. I, Wymetal, am informed that on receiving Joe's letter from the postboy Apostle Willard Richards, Nancy requested him to wait while she retired to peruse it in secret. The patient doctor having waited an hour, Nancy came back to him, letter in hand. She pretended to give it back, but with a sudden movement tore it to pieces and flung it into the stove. But she had in her retirement carefully copied it, and the next that was heard of it was in the columns of the Warsaw Signal, to the utter dismay of the prophet. Yeah, not sure how much of this is true. This is 1886, so long time after the fact. All right, let's go to another late account by Nancy's brother, John W. Rigdon. The life story of Sidney Rigdon. No date on it, but probably around 1900. Church History Library. And he does get some of the facts wrong here. So Nancy's brother John, sometime in the year of 1843, actually April 1842, my sister Nancy Rigdon, a young woman about 25 years old, no, she was 19 years old, attended church at Nauvoo on Sunday. After the conclusion of the services, she was invited by an old lady friend of hers to go home with her, which she did, Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde. After they had been there a little while, she began to talk to Nancy Rigdon of the doctrine of polygamy. All right, Nancy's brother, John W. Rigdon, continues. She told Nancy that it was a new doctrine. Miranda Nancy Johnson told Nancy that it was a new doctrine and was a great surprise to her when she heard of it, but it was going to become the great doctrine of the Mormon Church, and she believed it, and great exaltation would come to those who received and embraced it. While they were talking, Joseph Smith came to the house. Whether his visit had been arranged by him and the lady friend at whose house she had gone, I know not, but after Smith had been there for some little time, he proposed to Nancy Rigdon that she become his spiritual wife and be sealed to him for eternity, promising her great exaltation in the world to come. All right, John continues. This proposal she resented and utterly refused, and soon left the house and went home and told her father and mother what had taken place. All right, same account here. Nancy's father and mother were very indignant at Joseph Smith to think that he should make such a proposal to their daughter, and the matter was talked about by the family, and it got noised about the city of Nauvoo and caused considerable talk among the neighbors and acquaintances of the Rigdon family. All right, John W. Rigdon. So much was said about it that Joseph Smith came to the Rigdons' house and mentioned the subject and attempted to deny it. Nancy was not in the room at the time, but was in an adjoining room and heard what Smith had said. All right, the story continues. Her sister Athalia, Mrs. George W. Robinson, Athalia and George were married, was in the room at the time, and her mother and another woman whose name I do not recollect. Nancy was one of those excitable women, and she went into the room and said, "Joseph Smith, you are telling that which is not true." All right, John continues. Joseph did make such a proposition to me, and you know it, says Nancy. The woman who was there said to Nancy, "Are you not afraid to call the Lord's anointed a cursed liar?" Nancy says, "No." And Nancy replied, "I am not, for he does lie, and he knows it." That last sentence there is crossed out. Not sure who crossed that out. All right, Sidney Rigdon attempted, after hearing what was said, to go into the room where Joseph Smith was, but he was stopped by his wife, Phoebe, and the other women, and they thought it would be better for him to stay out, and Joseph Smith soon went away. You can see like a fight breaking out between Sidney and Joseph. All right, John Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon did not say much, only to those present, that Joseph Smith could never be sealed to one of his daughters with his consent, as he did not believe in the doctrine of plural marriage. And Sidney was very angry at Joseph Smith for making such a proposal to his daughter. The matter rested here for a time. All right, Joseph Smith admitted to Samuel James, Sidney Rigdon's cousin, that he had approached Nancy Rigdon and asked her to become his spiritual wife, and she had to go and blab it. Nancy was supposed to keep quiet, right? She wasn't supposed to go around Nauvoo and blab it. All right, John W. Rigdon, Nancy's brother, continues. After the private confrontation with the Rigdon family, a bad feeling existed between Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. They did not often meet, although they lived within a few rods of each other. They did not seem to be on very friendly terms, so the relationship became strained. And this is basically what the historian Richard Van Wagner was saying as well. All right, John W. Rigdon gives another account in the Salt Lake Tribune, May 20th, 1900, Visit of Rigdon's Son, the article's called. In there it says, Mr. Rigdon went on to say, that's John Rigdon, that in the early part of time year 1843, actually it's April 1842, Joseph Smith made a proposition of plural or spiritual marriage to his Rigdon's sister Nancy, then a young lady of about 21. No, she was 19. All right, John continues here in the Salt Lake Tribune. The proposal was indignantly refused by the young lady, Nancy. She at once told her father, Sidney Rigdon, of Smith's proposal. The elder Rigdon was very angry and called Joseph Smith to account. All right, 2 or 3 days afterwards, Joseph Smith called at the Rigdon home and attempted to deny the statement of Miss Nancy, when she promptly told the prophet that he was a liar and a scoundrel if he intimated that he had not made the proposition. Okay, Mr. John Rigdon said yesterday that he was present at this interview and remembers the circumstances as distinctly as though it had occurred only last week. After this interview, Mr. Rigdon said that Joseph Smith acknowledged to his father, Sidney, that he had proposed plural marriage to his daughter, Nancy, and begged forgiveness. I don't know. That doesn't sound like Joseph, right? Begging for forgiveness. All right, and then he says something different from his last account in the his life story. He says Sidney Rigdon pardoned the offense, and the prophet and his first counselor became good friends again. So that's kind of a contradiction. All right, so the next day, May 21st, 1900, an article shows up in the Deseret Evening News, a church newspaper. John W. Rigdon in Salt Lake. Only surviving son of Sidney Rigdon visiting old friends. Mr. Rigdon stated, and this is John, that it was his belief that Joseph Smith instituted the system of polygamy, and although he, Rigdon, never subscribed to the doctrine, he never said that it came from the devil, as was stated in the interview with a Morning Contemporary. All right, Deseret Evening News. Mr. Rigdon affirmed that the prophet Joseph made a proposal of marriage to his sister Nancy, who resented it with much spirit and went to her father Sidney about it with great indignation. And according to Mr. Rigdon, there was an altercation between his father Sidney and the prophet, which, however, was subsequently made right, and the two remained firm friends until the latter's death. That differs from his first account, like I had already mentioned. All right, and we have yet another account from John W. Rigdon, a letter to Arthur Welling, February 20th, 1904, LDS Church Archives. Joseph Smith made a proposition to my sister Nancy Rigdon to marry him, but she refused. She told her mother and father what Joseph had done. The story had got out and was the talk of the people of Nauvoo. Joseph came to my father's house when he was sick in bed and attempted to deny it, and Sister Mrs. Athalia Robinson was present. All right, John W. Rigdon continues in a letter to Arthur Wellington. Nancy was in another room. She heard what Joseph Smith said. She came rushing into the room and said to Joseph Smith, "You are a cursed liar. You did ask me to become your wife." My father was horror-stricken to think that he had a daughter who would call Joseph Smith a liar. Joseph Smith went away some few days, then he came back again. He was crying. He asked father's and mother's forgiveness and shook hands with all the family that were present and Nancy's hand, and then went away, and there the matter rested. All right, yet another account or affidavit from John W. Rigdon. July 28, 1905 now, and it shows up in a book called Blood Atonement and the Origin of Plural Marriage. This was correspondence between Joseph Fielding Smith and Richard C. Evans, I think from the Reorganized Church. So John goes on and tells the story again. And the deponent further says, Joseph the prophet made a proposition to my sister Nancy Rigdon to become his wife. It happened in this way. Nancy had gone to church, a meeting being held in a grove near the temple, a lot, I guess in Nauvoo, on which the Mormons were then erecting a temple. An old lady friend who lived alone invited her to go home with her, which Nancy did, and that old lady that invited her to go home with her was, of course, Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde. It's interesting to point out that Joseph Fielding Smith accepts Nancy's side of the story here. All right, affidavit of John W. Rigdon continues here in 1905. When they got to the house and had taken their bonnets off, the old lady began to talk to her about the new doctrine of polygamy, which was then being taught, telling Nancy during the conversation that it was a surprise to her when she first heard it, but that she had since come to believe it to be true. Pictured above, Joseph Fielding Smith and Richard C. Evans. Richard C. Evans became a high leader in the Reorganized Church. All right, John continues. While they were talking, Joseph Smith the prophet came into the house and joined them, and the old lady immediately left the room. Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde. It was then that Joseph Smith made the proposal of marriage to my sister. Nancy flatly refused him, saying if she ever got married, she would marry a single man, maybe like Francis, or none at all, not Joseph, who was married to Emma, she knew, and thereupon took her bonnet and went home, leaving Joseph at the old lady's house. All right, John continues. Nancy told father and mother of it, Sidney and Phoebe. The story got cut, and it became the talk of the town that Joseph had made a proposition to Nancy Rigdon to become his wife, and that she refused him. A few days after the occurrence, Joseph Smith came to my father's house and talked the matter over with the family, my sister Nancy and Mrs. Athalia Robinson. Okay, the feelings manifested by our family on this occasion were anything but brotherly or sisterly, more especially on the part of Nancy, as she felt that she had been insulted. A day or two later, Joseph Smith returned to my father's house when matters were satisfactorily adjusted between them, and there the matter ended. So that kind of disagrees with his first account, too. His first account stated that there was a lot of tension between Sidney and Joseph. All right, another account from Samuel M. Ellis. His mother was Nancy Rigdon. This is a letter to Lloyd J. Nauvoo, November 13, 1933, so a long time after the fact, a long, long time. This is in the archives of the church. So Samuel says, some years after the church was started and before the doctrine of polygamy was promulgated, Joseph Smith approached my grandfather, Sidney Rigdon, and suggested a second marriage with my beloved mother, who was Nancy Rigdon. Mr. Smith at this time was already married, of course, to Emma and a bunch of other women. The suggestion so incensed my grandfather that they came to an open break. So that's something different than what John was saying in his later accounts. Samuel here saying Sidney and Joseph came to an open break. All right, Samuel M. Ellis continues. Respecting the 1842 controversy that surrounded his mother, Samuel M. Ellis defended her by adding, someone is wrong, but I know my mother is not. He says Nancy was not wrong, for she was the person most concerned. I would believe her above any person living or dead. She was not misinformed of the circumstances. All right, a little bit more information about Nancy from George D. Smith in his book Nauvoo Polygamy, 2008. Nancy married Robert Ellis Jr. That's why she became Nancy Rigdon Ellis. Married Robert Ellis in September of 1846, a couple years after Joseph died. Gave birth to 9 children from 1847 to 1865, and died in November 1887 in Pittsburgh. Gravestone pictured above. All right. It's interesting to note that Nancy Rigdon Ellis left the mainstream Mormon church and joined her father's church. Robert Ellis, whom she married, was a member of Sidney Rigdon's newly formed Restoration Church as well. Sidney's church was called the Church of Jesus Christ of the Children of Zion. This was a church that condemned the Mormon doctrine of polygamy. You could see why Nancy would want to join that church after her negative experience with Joseph. Source for this is Sharon Lindblom article. You can see here on mrm.org, 2018, and then Wikipedia, the Sidney Rigdon article. We could talk about a few more facts about Nancy in her later life, but this video is already long enough, 3 hours and 50 minutes. So I thank you for watching the Joseph Smith's Polygamy, Nancy Rigdon and the Happiness Letter video.